The woman looked at the young girl and asked if it was still difficult for her to understand. The young girl bowed her head and timidly said that it was so. She looked at her and snowingly asked why she was so stupid. She said Claudel knew this at age 6. Claudel Cycleman was the young lady's only brother. He held an important place in the family, as he was supposed to be the next head of the family. By the age of 6, he had already memorized all the runes and grimoires, and he came up with his own rune by the age of 7. Everyone proclaimed him a genius, and his sister was told that she would never compare to him. She was told that she was not worth a toe on his foot. The young lady looked at her mother and asked for forgiveness. She said that she would try not to disappoint her again. The woman looked at the girl and said that she was very tired of her words. She looked at the girl and told her to forget about everything and just go back to her room. The young lady looked at her mother and obediently agreed. Walking to her room, the young lady noticed a piece of paper, which her mother threw away. The woman was very angry with her daughter. The young girl became very nervous when her mother insulted her. The young lady was very sad. She didn't know why she was the only one like that. She thought there was nothing she was capable of. The House of Cyclamen has produced talented magicians for many generations, and all famous, talented personalities also come from this place. Maybel Cyclamen was born into this family, but she did not know how to use runes. Using runes is a complex process for her, although it is the basis of magic. And that's why all the people looked at her as a disgrace to the family and told her about it every time. Maybel was very upset. She also wanted to succeed. She was momentarily distracted when she heard a noise. She stood up and saw her brother. The young man looked at her with a grin and called. The young lady looked at her brother and asked him if she had heard correctly what he just said. "Hey." He looked at her and asked with contempt if it mattered that he called her that. The young man looked at his sister and said with a grin that she was worse than him in everything. He said that he heard that she was scolded again today. He said that my mother said that she would not bring any benefit to the family. Maybel looked intently at her brother and saw their mother clearly. She remembered the unflattering words her mother had said. Maybel looked at her brother and asked why he came here. The young man looked at her and said that her mother told her to come down. She looked at him and asked if it was true. The young man asked with a grin if she was really hinting that he might be lying to her. He looked at his sister and said with a grin that she could ask her mom about it, and then they would see which one of them was a liar. The young lady looked at her brother and said that she understood everything and would come down now. Slowly, she walked towards the door. The young man snapped his fingers and she staggered. Maybel fell to the floor. She looked at her brother in surprise and shock. Claudel looked at his sister and said with a smirk that she should be more careful. Claudel looked at his sister and said with a grin that he just couldn't resist. A moment later, he said that he was very ashamed. The young lady glared at her brother as he walked away and grinned. Maybel looked at her bloody knees. She was in a lot of pain. She understood that if her mother was already waiting for her, then she would not have time to go to the servants' room and receive treatment there. She knew that the maids wouldn't just give her the medicine. The young lady tore a piece of fabric from her dress and bandaged her legs. She was also puzzled that she hadn't eaten yet. She thought she could grab something to eat on the way to the bottom floor. Her parents and brother didn't like her having dinner with them, and the maids found it too tedious to set the table again just for her. That's why she always sneaked into the kitchen to eat something. The young lady knew that first she had to go to her mother. Maybel slowly walked to the door and heard her parents talking. Ira looked at her husband and said that she had ordered him to take her to the young master. The husband said that he gives a lot of money, and he would like his wife to suffer a little more. But she in turn shouted that she did not need money, because she can't stand it anymore. She looked at her husband and asked when this would soon come, since 10 years had already passed. She looked at him and asked if he was going to take her back. The man looked at his wife and asked her to calm down. Ira was furious. The man looked at his wife and said that the girl was Rachiel's only child. He looked at his wife and asked if she didn't see this because he sent them money every time. Maybel was shocked. She didn't understand what they were talking about. She did not know the man named Rachiel. Ira looked at her husband and said with rage that he should immediately take this precious child for himself. She asked her husband if he knew what she was going through. She said she couldn't stand her in public anymore. The young lady realized that they were talking about her. The man looked at his wife and asked if she thought that she was the only one who could tolerate the girl. He angrily told you that he doesn't want to raise her either. Maybel opened the door and walked into the room. The couple shuddered as they did not expect to see her. The young lady looked at the couple and asked if she was not their child. Ira didn't want to talk to the girl. The man looked closely at the young lady and hesitated. He didn't know how to tell her about this. The young lady looked at the couple and asked them to say the young master's name, and she would immediately leave their house. Ira looked at Maybel with contempt. She said with a grin that the girl could do whatever she wanted. Ira looked at her and said that this place was not that far from their home anyway. The man looked at his wife and asked her to calm down. Ira looked at her husband and told him to calm down himself, since she was already tired of everything. Ira looked at the girl and said that this man's residence was on a hill north of here. She said that there were no other buildings there, so she could easily find a house. The man was shocked. He looked at the girl and wondered where she was going. Ira looked at her husband and said that the girl was going to her home, so she should be left alone. Ira looked at her husband and said that it would be better this way. She said that in the end, having to be in charge of her education irritates her to death. Ira told her husband that he only took her in because of the money. The man said that this was not so, and also asked his wife what she was talking about in the presence of the child. Ira said that he was simply afraid of this man. She said that if the young master had not given him money, he would have thrown her away long ago. Maybel was in shock. She knew that she needed to run to the residence to her real father. The young lady thought only about escape and nothing else. She knew that even if she was considered useless and despicable there, it was better that way than this place. Northern Mansion is an estate located next to a gloomy forest. There are many ghosts in this place. The maids mocked the young girl. They said that the ghosts of this estate catch useless children. Maybel lay under the blanket, bursting into tears. She was shaking furiously. Maybel didn't want to listen to them. Slowly, she left her previous home. The young lady didn't know if she was walking the right way. She wondered if she had come there. Maybel stared at the estate. It was huge. The young lady was very worried, but still she decided and knocked on the door. A moment later, a gray-haired man opened the door. The man looked closely at the young girl and asked who she was. The young lady hesitated and did not know what to answer. Many questions popped into her head. She wondered if her father would recognize her, and also if he really existed. She was very worried. The man looked at the young girl in bewilderment. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she wanted to come inside since it was quite cold outside. He said the city's winters are notoriously harsh. The man looked sideways at the girl and asked if she felt uncomfortable on the way to them. The man looked at the young lady and asked how she got to them. He also said that she was probably very cold. He asked her if she needed to bring a blanket. Walking along a long corridor, the man was carrying a lamp with a magic stone in his hands. Even for such a small magic stone, you need to spend an astronomical amount of money. The young lady looked closely at the stone. She thought he was very expensive. The man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that this is the living room and she can go inside. He opened the door and the young lady saw a spacious room. Maybel walked around the room looking at her intently. The man looked at the young girl and said with a smile that he would bring her tea. He also asked her what kind of tea she preferred. Maybel hesitated and timidly said that she didn't have one. Maybel looked at the man and timidly asked if she could be here. The man looked at her puzzled and asked what she was talking about. Maybel said quietly that she was sure he would send her away. She timidly said that he offered her tea, and it was very strange. The man knelt down and said with a smile that he didn't know what she was thinking, but the little lady could stay here. He looked at her and said with a smile that she had already proven who she was, so this mansion welcomed her. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and intently. She was puzzled by this answer. The man looked at her and said that while she was waiting, he wanted to give her something. The young lady looked at him in confusion. He looked at her and asked if she liked the sound of it. The man said that this is what the children in the mansion love. He smiled and said she could take it while she waited for him. Maybel looked at the rattle in surprise. The man looked at her and said with a smile that he thought she would like the toy. Maybel looked at the man and asked him to wait a little. She wanted to tell him something. A moment later, she saw that there was no one in the room anymore. The young lady saw the light. She was a little puzzled and didn't understand what she was seeing. A moment later, she moved closer to the window. The young lady was a little puzzled as the butler had been very kind to her, and she was shown something she had never seen before. She looked intently out the window, and she thought about what kind of person her father was. She thought it would be nice if he were nice. A moment later, her thoughts were interrupted because she heard someone open the door. A few minutes later, she heard a very loud sound. The young lady was at a loss. A moment later, she smelled the strong and cloying smell of blood. The man looked sideways at the young girl. He did not expect that there would be anyone in the room besides him. The man came closer to the girl and asked who she was. A moment later, many knives were visible at the young lady's throat. Maybel was shocked. She was very frightened and could not utter a word. The man looked at the young girl and angrily asked why she was silent. Maybel looked with horror in her eyes at all the swords that were pointed at her. She was trembling and could not say anything. The man looked at the girl and asked if she was his daughter. The man came closer to the young lady and asked if this was a simple illusion. The young lady was shocked. She hiccuped and said that she was his daughter. She was very frightened, and from fright she had an attack of hiccups. Maybel was in shock and could not calm down. The man looked at the girl intently and in surprise. A moment later, looking at his daughter, he said that she was small. Maybel was surprised. The man looked closely at his daughter and asked her to hold out her hands. The young lady looked at him in confusion. He looked at her and said that he would like to give her a gift. Maybel was surprised because she did not expect the man to give her a gift. He looked at her and asked if she liked it. The young lady was puzzled and said she liked it. She didn't understand what kind of gift it was. She saw an object that looked like a large seed. She noticed that the strange object was smooth, with fluffy fibers on the surface. The young lady pressed the object intently and asked, puzzled, what it was. The man looked at the girl and said that she was a monster. The young lady was shocked. She said in a trembling voice that this was the first time she had seen such a thing, and she did not know what it was. The man looked at her and said that he was sure that this was not often seen. Maybel bowed and thanked him. She was puzzled and wondered when the dear old butler would come. A moment later, someone opened the door. The man looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if he was already here. The man came closer to the gentleman and said that he had heard from Lice that he had already returned. He asked the gentleman which door he used. The man said, puzzled, that it was obvious that the gentleman had not entered through the main entrance. The man said that even though the gentleman lived less than everyone else, he behaves like an old man who has memory problems. He said that he asked the gentleman to use the door. The man looked at his master and said that when he teleports, the barrier from the house falls off. The gentleman looked at his subordinate and said that the barrier had already been broken. The man was shocked by what he heard. The man was furious. He looked at his master and asked how many times he had told him about this. The man looked at his subordinate and said with rage that he was too noisy. The man looked at the young lady and said that he was very sorry. And he also asked if the master had given her this gift. The young lady looked closely at the man and said that everything was fine, and she also nodded and said that the master gave it to her. The young lady looked at the men intently. She was a little surprised. A moment later, she looked at her father. She knew his name was Rachiel. The man looked at the gentleman and asked if he had greeted the girl. The gentleman looked at his subordinate and asked what he was doing. The man said it was basic common sense. Looking at the gentleman, he said that he did not understand this. The young lady looked intently at the men and asked for forgiveness. The young lady looked at them and asked when the butler, who had gone to get tea, would arrive. The man was shocked. He shuddered, not knowing what to answer. The man looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that it was he who was the butler. The man said, puzzled, that he wouldn't reveal the body so quickly. The man looked at her and said with a smile that he would now introduce himself formally. He said his name is Kanos, and he is the head butler of this mansion. He looked at her and said with a smile that she could just call him Khan. Khan looked at the young lady and said with a smile that this was her father, Rachiel. A moment later, he said that she had probably known about this for a long time. Rachiel glanced sideways at the young lady. Khan looked at Maybel and called out to her. Rachiel hit Khan. Khan was shocked. Rachiel looked at the butler and asked if it was his responsibility to ask the guest about the purpose of the visit. Kang looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he had already greeted her and the mansion would welcome her. He said they always strive to serve the guests they recognize to the best of their ability. He looked at her and said that, never mind her. Khan looked at the young lady and asked her how long she planned to stay here. Maybel was surprised and didn't know what to answer. A moment later, she said in a trembling voice that she planned to stay in the mansion for a while. Khan looked at her and said with a smile that he understood everything. Khan looked at my lady and said with a smile that they would try to serve her well during her stay here. A moment later, an incomprehensible atmosphere reigned between them. Maybel glared at Khan. A moment later, she asked if she could really stay in the mansion. The butler looked at her and said with a smile that of course she could stay. Rachiel looked at his butler and told him to leave everything to the 3 Florence sisters. Khan was very surprised, but a moment later he said that he understood the gentleman. The butler called his master and asked why he still didn't greet my lady. The butler said that she was the last thing Lady Galatia left him. Rachiel used his power on the butler. There was a loud crash and there were many swords near the butler. Rachiel looked at his butler and said that he only forgives mistakes once. He told his subordinate to be careful in future. Maybel was shocked by everything that was happening. The young lady said, in a trembling voice, that she was very sorry for coming to him. The young lady stared at her father. She knew that she had no place to return to. She didn't know if her father and butler would be disappointed if they found out that she had run away from home. She thought that, most likely, they might also hate her here. She thought that, most likely, her real father was a terrible person. The young lady was sleeping and had a dream about her old home. There she had her bedroom and another room. The young lady woke up and realized that it was just a dream. She suddenly remembered her former life. Later, she realized that it seemed that the meeting with her real father was not a dream. The young lady got out of bed and saw the carrots. She was very surprised since the carrot was very big. The maid saw that the young lady had woken up. She was very happy to see her. A moment later, she saw her sister and called out to her. She looked at her sister and said that the princess had woken up. The maid looked at her sister and, puzzled, said, "This is a young lady, not a princess." She told Laura that they must follow the rules set by Khan. The maid looked at the young lady and greeted her. She said her name was Scylla. Scylla looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had received orders from her master to serve. Scylla looked at her sister Laura and introduced her to Maybel with a smile. Scylla looked at the young lady and said that there was one more person, which she would like to introduce to her. The maid was confused because she didn't understand where the girl had disappeared to again. A moment later, she noticed Riza outside the door. Riza peeked quietly from behind the door. A moment later, the maid slowly approached the young mistress. Of the 3 sisters, she was the youngest sister. She looked at the young lady and greeted her with a smile. The young lady glared at all the maids. She was shocked because she didn't expect to see her. An awkward atmosphere filled the room. Waking up with the young lady was very hungry, and her stomach was making sounds. The young lady became very embarrassed and clutched her stomach. She felt very awkward. Laura looked at the young lady in surprise. She wanted to tell her something, but still remained silent. A moment later, she looked at Maybel and said that Khan had mentioned that she would be hungry when she woke up. Laura looked at Maybel and said with a smile that she had prepared for such an eventuality. She took out a carrot and offered it to the young lady with a smile. Laura looked closely at the lady and said that these were carrots from Altar. "It's big and hard." Laura looked at the mistress and said that since it was so big, it must be very tasty. Maybel looked at the maid in bewilderment. Laura stared at the young mistress. Laura didn't know if the food they eat here is different from what she usually eats. Maybel did not want to upset the maid and took up the carrots. With the first bite, Maybel realized that the carrots tasted bitter. Laura looked at the young mistress intently. She didn't know if she liked it. Laura looked at my sister and said that it looked like the young madams didn't like the food. She said that ponies usually eat this and they like it. Laura asked Scylla what they should do. Scylla looked at her sister and asked her if she remembered that a pony was a horse. Laura was confused and didn't know if people's taste was different from what animals liked. Scylla looked at her sister and said that she herself was not very sure. Riza stole a glance at her sisters and told the lady that she needed something different. Riza looked at her sisters and asked, what about what she had prepared? Maybel looked at the sheet Riza had prepared in surprise, but a moment later she picked it up and tasted it. The young lady was surprised and really liked it. She felt the sweet taste. Maybel looked at the maids and said with a smile that the food tasted like cotton candy. Laura looked at the young mistress with a smile. She told her sisters that the young lady seemed to really like the magic herb. Scylla looked at the young lady and asked if she wanted more. Maybel looked at the maids and with an embarrassed smile asked if she could have some more. Scylla smiled and said that, of course you can. She asked the young lady to eat everything with a smile. Maybel was surprised as the grass fell on her like rain. Scylla looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that it was all hers. She said that everything around is hers. Maybel looked fascinated at the grass that was flying around the room. Scylla looked at her mistress and said with a smile that she could address them informally by their names. She also asked the young miss to treat them as a friend. Maybel looked at them and said with a surprised smile that she would do so. A moment later, Maybel asked them if they were human or not. Scylla looked at the young mistress and asked with a smile why she thought so. Laura whispered to her sister that she heard that Kang had already been exposed. Scylla was surprised, as she did not expect to hear something like that. She said that in that case, they could talk about themselves. Scylla looked at the young mistress and said that she had thought everything correctly, since they are not people, but nymphs. Scylla said that, as a rule, people called them not nymphs, but fairies. However, they are nymphs and differ in the parts that make up the flower. Scylla is the bud, Laura is the leaves, and Riza is the root. Scylla said that there are 3 of them and they are different, but still they came together to form a single whole. The butler slowly approached them. He was very surprised and did not understand why they were still in the young lady's room. Khan looked at Scylla and asked what this all meant. He wondered why the little lady was still released and not even washed. He was in shock and did not understand where the grass and vegetables came from. Scylla looked at Khan and asked him to calm down. She said it was just part of the young lady's meal. Khan was shocked. He said that he had previously told the maids that people don't eat that kind of stuff. The butler sighed heavily and said that he should have resisted when the master decided to leave everything to them. Sighing heavily, he said that it was his fault. The young maids looked closely at the butler and said that it was entirely his fault. They also said with a grin that his disguise had fallen apart. Khan looked at them and told them to stop talking. Riza looked at the young mistress and asked if she felt uncomfortable while bathing. Maybel looked at the maid and said that everything was fine. The young lady looked intently out the window. Riza came closer to the young mistress and said that a poplar tree could be seen outside the window. He is a grandfather who has been around for a long time. The young lady was puzzled. She did not know whether the tree was old or still young, since it was called grandfather. The maid looked at the young mistress and with a smile told her to help herself. Maybel was surprised. It was the first time she had seen so much food on the table. The young lady didn't even believe that it was meant for her, since in her previous house she ate completely differently. Maybel looked at the maid in surprise, because she used magic to move the plates. Scylla used her magic and they literally floated in the air. Maybel looked closely at Scylla and asked if this was also magic. Laura looked at her sister and said that the young lady had noticed everything correctly. However, the eldest sister was the only one who could do this. The young lady slowly began her meal. She was surprised because the food was really very tasty. Laura looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that Alkin would try his best for her every day. Kang looked at the young lady and asked how her food was. He asked with a smile if the food suited her preferences. Maybel smiled and said that everything was very tasty. Kang looked at the young lady and said that since she had finished her meal, she could have a cup of tea. He said with a smile that there would be chamomile tea today. Kang looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that now he would endure whatever snack he might have for tea. The young lady looked at the butler and said that he didn't have to do that. A moment later, the young lady noticed something under the table. She was very surprised. Maybel saw a tail under the chair. She was surprised and didn't know what it was. The young lady touched her tail. A moment later, a boy crawled out from under the table. He looked at the young lady and asked if that was rude of her. He said that touching someone's tail like that is very reckless. Maybel looked at the boy and asked for forgiveness. She said she didn't know it was his tail. The young man was surprised. He said that she probably thought the single man was cute and decided to touch him. The young lady looked at the young man puzzled and said that it was so, because the tail looks very fluffy and soft, like cotton candy. She said, puzzled, that she couldn't help herself and wouldn't do it again. The young man looked at the young lady and said that he thought that this time he could forgive her. but this is not because she praised his tail. He looked at her and asked if she understood him. The young lady became embarrassed and said that she understood everything. Maybel looked at the young man and asked what his name was. A moment later, she introduced herself. The young man looked at the young lady and said that he knew because she was the daughter of the master. The young man looked at the young lady and introduced himself with a smile. He said his name was Avelk. Avelk said with a smile that he was the master's right hand, and here he is, second in skill. The young man looked at the young lady and said that he really did not intend to come all the way here. He said that if he was discovered, he would be in trouble. The young lady was surprised. Avelk looked at the young mistress and said that he still did not have permission to come here, but of course he will definitely get it. Maybel looked at the boy in surprise and asked why he needed permission. Avelk told the young lady that the floor she was on was closed, and usually no one was allowed in without permission. Avelk heard the servants talking, and I got distracted for a moment. A moment later, he walked closer to the young mistress and told her to keep in mind that he didn't like her and didn't want to get involved with her. Avelk said that she still had a pleasant smell. After all that was said, he climbed onto the windowsill with the speed of lightning. He looked closely at the young mistress. A moment later, he said with a smile that for this reason he would watch her closely. With the speed of lightning, he jumped from the windowsill. Maybel was shocked because he had jumped from a great height. She came closer to the window and saw that he was gone. A few minutes later, the butler entered the room. He looked at the young lady and asked what she was doing at the window. Can looked at the lady and said with a smile that he had brought her a delicious dessert. He said it was a sweet pie. Can looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would like to meet Mr. Rachiel after she finished her tea. The young lady shuddered as she did not expect such a question. The young lady hesitated a little and became nervous. She looked at the butler and asked if she could do it. Khan looked at her and said that, of course, it is possible. He said that he was sure that the master would really like her if they met. Maybel looked at the butler and timidly asked how many floors there were in this residence. Khan said there are 4 visible floors, but if you take into account the hidden floors and basement, then there are many more of them. He said that there are people and non-humans like him living in this place. Khan looked at the young lady and asked how about a tour of the residence and then meeting with the master. Maybel smiled and nodded. She really wanted to go on an excursion. Kang looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he would call her when the master returned. But until then, she needed to take a good rest. The young lady entered the room and noticed that it was very clean. She decided to go to the bathroom and see if it was cleaned. She noticed that no one had cleaned the bathtub yet. Maybel was even very happy for a minute. She decided to remove everything with lightning speed. The young lady began to slowly clean up. After cleaning, she gazed at the fruits of her labor. She was happy and thought that most likely everyone would be happy when they saw the frequency. The young lady thought that if she said that she would do this regularly, then perhaps they would let her stay a little longer. A moment later, the butler knocked and entered the room. Kang looked at her and said that he actually came here while he was waiting for the master. A moment later, he looked at the young lady and asked what she was doing here. Maybel didn't know why he was so surprised. She looked at him and said with a smile that she was just cleaning the bathroom. Kang looked at the young miss and said that she didn't have to do such things. He said that he would have to take care that this would not happen again. The young lady looked at the butler and said that it was okay as she had done this often, so there was no need to worry. She said that she could do everything herself. The butler was shocked and asked what they were talking about. He looked at her and asked if she really cleaned herself when she lived in the Cyclamen residence. Maybel looked at him and said that it was so. The butler was shocked. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't know why he was angry and thought that she most likely did something wrong, but still she didn't know what she had to do. She was shaking because she was very scared. Rachiel came closer to her and asked his daughter why she cleaned here. The young lady said in a trembling voice that it was because she thought that she had to take care of her own space. Rachiel raised his hand. The young lady was scared and cowered. She thought that he would run around her. A moment later, her father patted her on the head and told her she was doing well. The young lady was surprised because she did not expect this. No one had ever praised her or patted her on the head before. She looked at her father in surprise for some time. Rachiel looked at the butler and said that he would drink tea in his office. The butler looked at the gentleman with a puzzled look and said that he would do everything now. A moment later, they left the young lady alone and left. Maybel stared after them. She was very embarrassed and touched. Some time later, they were sitting on the street and going to drink tea. The butler looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he thought this place would be better than a study. Kang looked at the young lady and said with a smile that the master also agreed with his words. Maybel was very surprised as I noticed that there was not only a cake on the table, but also other pastries. She noticed that there was even sherbet. Khan laughed and asked for forgiveness. He looked at the young lady and said she was too cute. The young lady blushed and clutched her dress. She was very embarrassed because she had never received such compliments before. She was only complimented once, and it was because she cleaned the floor well. Rachiel looked at the butler and asked where his tea was. Kan looked at the master puzzled and asked for forgiveness. In the book that the young lady read earlier, there is a part that says that those gifted with magic age very slowly. Despite their advanced age, they retain a youthful appearance. She was very interested in whether it was possible that her father was the same. The butler looked at the young lady and asked if she liked the tea. The young lady smiled and said that the tea was very tasty. She looked at Kana, asked if he himself had prepared such wonderful tea. Khan smiled and said that it was so. He said that all the tea in the residence is grown and processed only by him. The young lady looked at the butler and said with a smile that he was truly amazing. Khan was embarrassed and smiled at such praise from the young mistress. Rachiel looked at the butler puzzled and called him. A moment later, Rachiel said that this tea tasted different. Khan was puzzled. He asked for forgiveness and said that this simply could not happen. He looked at the gentleman and said that he meant that perhaps he had brewed it at the wrong temperature. Rachiel looked at the butler and said that he was too close anyway. He asked the butler to take 10 steps back. Khan was surprised and did not understand what was going on. The gentleman looked at his subordinate and said that he did not see the greenhouse. Khan was surprised. But a moment later, he looked at the gentleman and said that in that case he would move away so as not to block the view. The young lady was shocked and did not understand what kind of greenhouse she was talking about. The young lady stared at her father. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that Khan is a capable butler. Maybel told her father that she was thinking about it too. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he was not her nanny, and her nannies are 3 sisters, Florence. The young lady looked at him puzzled and agreed, but still she did not understand why he was telling her this. Rachiel looked at his daughter and asked if she liked sweets. The young lady was puzzled by this question, and a moment later she replied that she really liked sweets. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said, puzzled, that she was right. There were too few of them here. A moment later, he snapped his fingers, and magically there were a lot of sweets on the table. The young lady was puzzled and didn't know if she could eat it all. She slowly tried dessert after dessert. She was very happy because it was very tasty. When the young lady ate various desserts, she looked very much like a little hamster. Kan couldn't help but laugh. The young lady was embarrassed. Rachiel looked at the butler in surprise and intently. The butler smiled and said he thought they didn't have enough tea. He looked at the gentleman and said with a smile that he would probably go and bring some more tea as soon as possible. A moment later, awkwardness reigned between father and daughter. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't know whether it was awkwardness or discomfort. A few minutes later, the father handed his daughter a plate of desserts. The young lady was puzzled and thanked him slowly. She said she would eat it. The plate was floating in the air. She had so many questions she wanted to ask. As soon as I met my real father. Rachiel gazed at his daughter. A few minutes later, he stood up from his chair with lightning speed. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why he behaved this way. Rachiel came closer to the bush and saw little Avelk. Avelk looked at the gentleman and was puzzled, saying that he was in pain. The gentleman looked at the young man with a fixed and fierce gaze. He said he was pretty sure he had banned him from coming here. Avelk looked away from the master and said that he simply dozed off here. He told the master that, as he knows, they representatives of the fox race consider the afternoon nap to be very important. Awelk said that when he opened his eyes, he was also surprised to see Mr. Young Lady. Rachiel looked at the young man and said that he was on probation. Rachiel looked at the young man and asked, "Why don't they talk somewhere else?" Avelk was puzzled. He said that he still hadn't done anything. The young lady watched them closely. The young man came closer to the gentleman and said that he was very sorry as he had made a big mistake. Avelk looked intently at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. He said he was immature and took them by surprise. He asked for forgiveness again. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said that this was their first meeting. And he is the younger brother Canosa and the next butler? A moment later, he said his name. The young lady was surprised as he was not acting like that at all. Now he was very scared and behaved submissively differently than when they first met. The young lady was taken aback and did not know what to answer. The gentleman looked at his daughter and asked if she knew him. Avelk looked at the young mistress and said in a whisper that it was a secret. He asked not to tell the master. The young lady looked at her father and hesitatingly said that she thought she was seeing him for the first time. She said she was just staring because his tail and ears looked adorable. Avelk sighed, as he was very glad that she did not rat him out. Rachiel looked closely at his daughter and asked if this was really so. A moment later, he asked how old they both were. Avelk looked at the gentleman and said that he was 12 years old. Maybel looked at her father and said that she was 10 years old. Rachiel looked at Avelk with a cold gaze, and he told him to stay away. The young man looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Rachiel looked at Avelk and told him to go and find his brother. The young man bowed and said that he understood everything and would do everything. Rachiel looked at his daughter and called to her. The young lady was taken aback and shuddered, as she did not expect him to call her. Rachiel looked at his daughter and asked if she had eaten. The young lady nodded and said that she had eaten. A moment later, she jumped off the chair. Maybel was surprised and thought that most likely the tea party had already ended. My lady went after her father. Maybel followed her father closely and looked at his hair. She wondered if her hair looked like that to other people. The young lady slowly combed her hair. She had the same hair color as her father. But for some reason, when she touched them, the sensations were completely different. She noticed that the sun had already begun to set. She felt as if the dark blue sky was reflected in her father's hair. A moment later, she stopped, out of breath. Maybel was a little puzzled because her father was walking too fast. Rachiel stopped and looked closely at his daughter. A moment later, he asked her why she was not coming. He looked closely at her first, and then turned his gaze to her legs. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that her legs were too short. The young lady was puzzled, since she herself knew very well that her legs were too short. Rachiel looked closely at the young lady and said that everything was fine, since she was just growing. Rachiel looked at his daughter and gently asked her to come closer to him. Slowly, she approached him. A moment later, they continued on their way. The young lady was a little surprised as she noticed that her father had slowed down, and now they walked to Rovno. Several days have passed since then, and she learned that her father was not such a bad person as she imagined him to be. Maybel saw Laura and greeted her with a smile. Laura looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that her tea party seemed to go very well. Maybel smiled and said that was true. She said that she ate a lot of delicious cakes and looked around the greenhouse. Laura looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that she was sure that tomorrow would be even more interesting. Laura looked at Maybel and asked how about going for a walk. She said that of course they would be within the residence. Kang looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he still hadn't shown her the entire mansion. Khan said he thought today might be a good time to do so. The young lady was puzzled. She looked at the butler in surprise and asked if she could really see the mansion. The butler looked at her and said with a smile that of course she could, and they had prepared something for her. Khan looked at the maids and pointed at them. He asked the lady if she could see it. He said that the maids were very excited just because of her. The maids looked through the different outfits with a smile. They wanted to immediately put one of the outfits on the young mistress. Kang looked at the young lady and said with a smile that it was a secret that only he and Milady knew. He asked her to remain silent and not say anything to anyone. A moment later, Khan looked at the young lady and asked if she was coming with him. Maybel was surprised when she saw Avelk. Khan came closer to her and quietly said that this child helps around the house. Khan said that this was his younger brother Avelk. The young man looked at the young lady and told her to simply call him Abel. He looked at his brother and said that there was no need to call him by his own nickname. Khan walked closer to his brother and asked why he was talking so rudely in front of the little lady. Abel was shocked. He told his brother to let him go quickly. Kang looked at his brother and told him with a smile to behave as it was his responsibility. Abel looked at his brother and said that he understood everything and asked to let him go. Kant looked at the young mistress and asked, "How about we take a tour of the residence right now?" As they walked down the stairs, Khan talked about the third floor and what rooms were on each floor. Kang looked at the young lady and said that on the second floor there are guest rooms, the master's office, and a library. Maybel was surprised when she heard about the library. She really wanted to look inside. Kang looked at the young lady and asked if she wanted to look at the library. The young lady hesitated and said that if everything was in order, she would like to look there. Khan smiled and said that, of course, she could stop by without any problem. Khan looked at the young people and asked, "How about we walk through the library together?" The young man and the young lady were frightened and shuddered. They were surprised and asked the butler what he was talking about. Khan looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that they seemed very surprised by this. Khan looked at the young mistress and said that Abel was actually more familiar with the library than he was, and he learned a lot from the master himself. Khan said that while my lady was visiting the library, he would prepare the afternoon tea. The young lady looked at the butler and said that she understood everything and they could go together. Kang said that it wouldn't last long and he wouldn't be able to leave them alone for a long time anyway. Kang came closer to the young mistress and quietly said that in fact, the master had told him never to leave the two of them alone for more than 10 minutes. The young lady was surprised and did not understand what he was talking about. Abel looked at them in surprise. Kang looked at the young miss and said with a smile that he went to the kitchen. Maybel was very surprised because she did not understand why the Khan said that he should not leave them alone. The young lady gazed after the butler. Abel looked at the young lady and asked why she was standing. He said they had to go. Maybel stared at the young man for many minutes. Abel looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she was looking like that. Maybel looked at the young man in surprise and said that his tone had changed. Abel looked at her and asked if she didn't like it. Maybel looked at the young man and said with a smile that everything was not like that at all. Abel frowned at the young lady for a moment. A moment later, he turned around and walked towards the library. Abel said that even if he said so, it did not mean that he was going to neglect his duty. The young lady was puzzled. She said that she could not hear him at all. Without turning around, Abel said that he told her to quickly go. He said that she wanted to look at the library. The young lady stared at his tail. She knew that a cat's tail moves like that when its owner is in a good mood. But apparently the young man was not in a good mood. The young man looked at the young lady and said that one must be quiet in the library. Abel looked at her and asked if she understood. Maybel looked at the young man and nodded with a smile and said that she understood him. Abel smiled as he was very glad that she understood him. A moment later, they creaked the door open. Maybel was very surprised and embarrassed. She had never seen such beauty before. The young lady was shocked as she had never seen such a large library. For several minutes she stood spellbound and gazed at all the books. Abel looked at the young mistress and said that there is spatial manipulation magic in the library. That's why she looks so big. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if she could call him Abel. A moment later she said that she would not call him that if he was against it. The young man looked at the young mistress and said that she could call him whatever she wanted. A moment later, he told her that he hadn't acknowledged her yet. Maybel looked at the young man and asked if it was because she and the master didn't look alike at all. Abel looked at the young lady in surprise and asked who told her that. He said that she is an exact copy of the master. Abel looked at the young lady and said that she could still become the master's successor. He also said that he didn't like a guy named Bellerophon. Abel looked at the young lady and asked how he should feel about the successor who had appeared so suddenly. And she was surprised and did not believe that she could be a successor. Abel said that he is not sure, but after all, she is the daughter of Mr. Great Wizard, so she will definitely have amazing abilities. Abel looked at the young lady and said that he did not trust her and would not approve of her until he saw her abilities with his own eyes. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't know what to do, since in fact she did not know how to use magic at all. She didn't know if she should say that she didn't have any amazing abilities. Abel looked sideways at the young lady and said that in any case, he would guide her properly. Therefore, it doesn't matter what she calls him. He looked at her and said that he usually doesn't try to explain this to people, so he asked her to listen to him carefully. Abel looked at the young lady and asked if she understood him. They walked around the library for some time. and the young man told everything to the young lady. Maybel listened to his story with rapt attention. He showed her the bookshelves where there were magical books. They contained records going back thousands of years. He said that the larger the book, the more magic it contains. The young man looked at the young lady and said that these books have their own will. They follow only those who have been recognized as a magician. Maybel was very surprised because she did not know this. She looked at the young man and asked if all these books really recognize only Mr. Rachiel. Abel looked at her and said that, of course, they would recognize him. He said that his master is a very powerful magician, and she should know about it. After a short story, he looked at her and said that they needed to move on and look at other books. The young lady was surprised because she noticed a strange book on the shelf. She didn't know what it was. A moment later, she saw the door. Maybel looked intently at the door as she felt very strong magical energy from that place. Abel looked at the young lady and asked if she was following him. The young lady looked at the young man and asked what sections these were. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she saw. She looked at it and said that it showed the coat of arms of Cyclamen. She looked at the young man and asked if this section was really connected with them. Abel looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really saw this. The young lady was surprised. A moment later, Abel said that she was right, and that this section contained books related to the house of Cyclamen. Abel looked at her and said that, for example, he doesn't see anything there, but she seems to see everything. Maybel looked at the young man and asked if she could look around there in that case. The young man looked at the young lady and said that she could see everything without any problems, but, unfortunately, he would not be able to go with her. The young man said that only the head of the family and the head butler could enter this place. Abel looked at the young lady and said he thought she would be okay. The young lady was surprised and asked him why he thought so. Abel looked at her and said with a smile that it was all because the master gave her permission to move anywhere in this residence, and all the magic contained in this house is on her side. Abel looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he would wait for her here so that when she looked, she could come back. Maybel looked at the young man and thanked him. The young lady walked around and carefully examined all the books that were in the library. She was surprised because she saw that there was nothing here except books. A moment later, she stumbled and grabbed the book. Unexpectedly, a symbol began to glow on her hand. For a moment, she lost her balance. She was very surprised as she noticed that it was the coat of arms of Cyclamen. A moment later, she found herself in another room. Maybel was very surprised. She didn't know where she had ended up and what to do now. She thought that she had soon done something that she shouldn't have done. The young lady was very upset. But still, she knew that she did not need to be upset and needed to quickly figure out how to get out of the incomprehensible room. The young lady carefully examined everything she saw in the room. Maybel saw many pictures. She noticed that there were a lot of paintings. The young lady was puzzled and did not know if among all the portraits there was a portrait of her mother. A moment later, she saw her father and was very surprised. She watched her father silently for some time. She thought that soon I would just be sleeping very soundly. The young lady realized that she needed to quietly leave the room. She didn't want to disturb her father at all. A moment later, Rachiel opened his eyes. He looked at her intently and in surprise. Maybel was very surprised and frightened. She looked at her father and asked if he was awake. Rachiel looked at his daughter and calmly said that he was not sleeping. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he had not slept since the moment she came here. A moment later, he asked why she was there. The young lady looked away, puzzled, and said in a trembling voice that she was looking around the library and saw the coat of arms of the house of Cyclamen. Rachiel was very surprised. He got up from the sofa and asked if she really saw him. A moment later, he snapped his finger and a warm cape appeared on her shoulders. Maybel was surprised. The cape turned out to be very soft, like Abel's host. She even smiled because she remembered the young man. Rachiel looked closely at his daughter. He gently and calmly told her that when he looks into her smiling face, he remembers someone. The young lady looked closely at her father and asked if her smile reminded him of her mother. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that she said everything correctly. A moment later, he looked at the young lady and showed her something. Maybel was very surprised when she saw the staff. She looked at her father and asked if this beautiful staff was her mother. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that these were her mother's. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and asked if her mother was also a sorceress. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said with a smile that her mother was an excellent cleric. He said that this was the last artifact she left as a keepsake. Maybel looked at her father and asked if there was a portrait of her mother among these paintings. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he was not here. Rachiel looked at Maybel and softly asked if she wanted to watch it. He said he thought she had already seen it. He looked at her and asked if she had not been shown a portrait of her mother. The young lady looked at her father and asked for forgiveness. She said that she actually didn't even know that she had real parents. Rachiel shuddered and looked at his daughter in surprise. He asked if she didn't know. The young lady looked at her father, puzzled, and said that she really didn't know. Rachiel looked at the young lady and gently stroked her head. He said he usually goes out hunting monsters, but is now thinking about not doing it anymore. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her father and asked why he wanted to do this. Rachiel gently stroked the young lady and with a soft smile said that it was all because now there was someone in this house who would wait for him. Maybel was puzzled. She didn't know if she could now call him father. Rachiel looked at the young lady intently and said that they had spent too much time here and they needed to go back. He looked at his daughter and extended his hand to her. The young lady hesitated a little, and she didn't know what to do. A moment later, she jumped off the couch. She timidly looked at her father and asked for forgiveness. Rachiel looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had nothing to apologize for. A moment later, he snapped his fingers, and the young lady began to float in the air. She was shocked and perplexed. Rachiel slowly walked towards the exit, and his daughter followed him, floating in the air. Maybel was a little puzzled and didn't know what to say. My lady looked at her father and said that he treats her very well. She looked at him and timidly asked why he never visited her. Rachiel looked sideways at his daughter and said that he could not come to her because she had to find him first. He looked at her and said that, however, this did not mean that he never came to her. The young lady was puzzled as she had never met him at the Cyclamen residence. Rachiel looked at the door and said that it was the portal of the Cyclamen family, and it changes depending on who enters it first. He looked at her and said that if she entered first, the area that would appear would be different from the one that would appear if he entered first. The young lady looked at him, puzzled, and asked if this meant that if the people from the Cyclamen house entered this portal, everything would change as well. He looked at her and said he wasn't sure. The young lady looked at her father and asked if Big Brother could use this spell. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he knew nothing about this child. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that at the moment the only ones who can use this portal are him and her. Just the two of them, and no one else. A moment later, they entered the library. Maybel looked at her father and said that Abel was still outside waiting for her. Rachiel looked at her sideways and asked why Abel was waiting for her. He was very surprised. The young lady hesitated and said that she had never met anyone around her age, so she thought that they could become friends with him. Rachiel gazed at his daughter. A moment later, he turned around and said that they would only see each other at lunch. The young lady watched him closely. She didn't know if she understood correctly that by meal he meant lunch. She didn't know if this meant they would eat together. Abel looked closely at the young lady and asked what she saw there. A moment later, he asked her again what she saw there that made her smile so beautifully. The young lady hesitated and became embarrassed. Abel looked sideways at her and said that compared to the day when he first met her, then she was very gloomy and nervous, and now she looks much happier. Khan approached the young people and asked how they enjoyed the excursion. Maybel looked at him and said that she really enjoyed the tour. She said the library was so big that they spent a lot more time there than she thought. Kang looked at them and said with a smile that he needed to prepare dinner according to the master's instructions. Khan looked at them and said that this would take quite a long time, so he would like to ask her for a favor. Khan looked at the young lady and asked him to give the scroll to the master. He said that the gentleman's office is on the top floor, a room near the stairs. Maybel knocked on the door and opened it. She timidly asked if there was anyone in the office, and she also said that it was she who came. The young lady went into the office. She noticed that there was no one there. She slowly put the scroll on the table. The young lady noticed that there were medicinal herbs on the table. The young man came closer to her and said that she should not touch them so casually. Taking off his hood, he said he was wondering who was there. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that it was her. He came closer to her and said that she was an adored young lady and the treasure of this residence. The young man asked her forgiveness and took her hand. A moment later, he healed the wound on her arm. The young man looked at the young lady and with a smile asked her to be more careful in future. Maybel was a little puzzled. She looked at the young man and asked who he was. The young man looked at the young lady and said that he was Bellerophon. The young man said with a smile on his face that he was the first student of Sir Rachiel. Maybel looked at him in surprise. She didn't expect him to be a student. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she could talk to him as she pleased. The young man looked at the young lady and said that it was very strange that she had not heard of him. He said with a smile that, although he was sure everyone was very busy getting to know her. Moreover, they had all been waiting for her for a long time. He smiled and said that he was also curious. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said that this medicinal herb is called shalom, and it contains strong poison, but can cause symptoms similar to fatigue. He looked at her and said that it was not because she only touched her a little. The poison did not spread. The young man looked at her and asked if she was here to see the teacher. Maybel looked at him and said that everything was correct. Bellerophon P. looked at the young lady and said with a smile that the teacher had left for a while. He said he thought the teacher would be back soon, but he was a little late. A moment later, a bird appeared in his hands. The young lady stared at the bird. She had never seen anything like it before. Bellerophon looked at the young mistress and said that the teacher, perhaps the dining room. He looked at the young lady and asked how about heading straight there. Maybel looked at the young man and thanked him. Maybel looked at the young man and asked if they would see each other again. She said with a smile that the bird was adorable. Maybel said that this was the first time she had seen such a wonderful and beautiful spell. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that this was more likely not a magic spell, but a manifestation of mana. Bellerophon smiled and told the young lady that he was sure she could do so too. The young lady was a little puzzled. She timidly said that she did not know how to use magic. The young man was a little surprised and puzzled, but a moment later he said that he understood everything. The young man came closer to the young lady and said that she may not be able to do this today, but who knows what tomorrow might bring. He was sure that she would succeed. Maybel walked slowly into the dining room. She heard that the dining room was on the first floor. Walking down the corridor, Maybel felt tired and began to sway. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening. Everything seemed very strange to her, since her new acquaintance healed her. But still she could not resist and fell. Rachiel looked intently at his daughter, who was lying on the bed. A moment later, he looked at the butler and asked if she had touched Shalome. The butler looked at the young lady and said what he thought. My lady touched the grass that was lying on the master's table. Rachiel looked at the butler and said that he was not asking what kind of poison it was. He asked first of all why his daughter might be poisoned. The butler looked at the gentleman but did not answer. Rachiel was very alarmed. He timidly said that his daughter should have had magical immunity. The butler, puzzled, said that he thought the young lady was not immune to magic. He timidly said that, to be more precise, it was more like there was no magic in her. Rachiel told the butler that magical immunity is the absolute minimum. He looked at the butler and asked if he really meant to say that they had allowed her to live with no immunity at all. Khan looked at the master and said that my lady was suffering from poison and could not remain conscious for long. Khan said her health has declined since then. Maybel came to her senses a little and heard their conversation. She would like to say that she is fine and nothing hurts, but she could not say a word. Rachiel looked at his daughter and told the butler to bring more towels and some clean water. Maybel lay on the bed and was delirious. She saw her former mother. Ira screamed at the young lady and called her names. Maybel was shaking and crying. She cried furiously and said that she was very sorry, and she also asked her mother not to hit her. Maybel woke up from gentle touches. She realized that it was her father. The young lady was surprised. Rachiel looked at his daughter and stroked her head tenderly. He told her everything was fine, and she could sleep some more. The young lady fell asleep, and he slowly left her room. He was furiously angry. Rachiel was furious. He repeated the name of the family in which his daughter lived several times. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and in surprise, and asked where he was going. Rachiel said with rage in his voice that he needed to go to the cyclamen residence. Maybel woke up and went to look for her father. Khan noticed her and called her. Kant looked at the young lady and asked where she was going. The young lady dropped her head and said nothing. Khan looked at the young lady and said that he was afraid that she might fall again. Kant calmly said that she needed more rest. He looked at her and asked if she was feeling well now or what. Abel watched the young lady closely. Maybel looked at the butler and asked where her father was. Kang looked at the young lady and said that the gentleman had gone to the cyclamen residence. The young lady, in a trembling voice, told him not to tell her that he went there alone. Kang looked at the young mistress puzzled and did not say that this was exactly the case. Maybel looked at the butler and asked him to move away, as she was about to go there too. Kang was surprised. He looked at the young lady and said that she could not go there. She looked at him and said that if she didn't go there now, it would be too late. Kang looked at the young lady in surprise and said that it would be dangerous now. He wanted her to stay at the residence. Maybel looked at the butler and asked if he was going to fight her adoptive parents. She looked at the butler puzzled and said that her dad might get hurt. The maids looked closely at the young lady and said that the master asked them to take care of her while he was away. Kang looked at the young lady and said that he would take full responsibility. Khan slowly carried the young lady in his arms. Walking along the road, Khan saw Abel. He looked at him, and he, in turn, said that he knew everything and everything would be fine. Bellerophon looked at the butler and said with a smile that they would protect this place. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said that because while the master is not there, she is the mistress of this house. The young lady snuggled closer to Khan. Bellerophon came closer to the young lady and said with a smile that they would all follow her orders. The young lady hesitated. She said in a trembling voice that she was just asking for a favor. Abel looked at them sideways and asked who she was to ask for such a thing. The young lady glanced sideways at the butler. The butler looked at the young lady and said with a smile that everything was fine. He looked at the young men and said that now he would leave everything to them. They walked slowly. For a moment they stopped and the young lady smiled and waved. Khan looked at her and asked her to hold on tight. The young lady pressed herself close to him. A moment later they ran as fast as lightning. Kang looked at the young lady and asked if she was cold. The young lady smiled and said that she was fine and not cold at all. The young lady knew that she was stubborn, but even if that was the case, Kang listened to her and did not scold her. She felt very sorry for the butler. Khan looked at the young lady and asked if she could see the huge rock to her right. The young lady looked at the butler and said that she was shaped like a rock. Khan smiled and said that the gentleman always went to this rock to observe the cyclamen residence. Khan said it was more like he was enjoying the view. The young lady was puzzled, wondering why he couldn't just come and get her. Kang looked at the young mistress and said that it may be difficult to accept now, but one day the master himself will explain everything to her. Kang looked at the young lady and said that they were almost there. He gently told her to hold on tight, since the fence is supported by a magical barrier. Khan looked at her and said that their race is less susceptible to the influence of magic and the barrier seems to have already been neutralized. A moment later they heard a loud crash. Kang looked at the young mistress and asked if she was okay. The young lady said in a trembling voice that she was fine, and looking at the butler, asked how he was feeling. Kang looked at the young lady and said that he was also fine and that he was fine. He looked at her and said that these must be magical waves. Khan looked puzzled at the devastation and said that he thought it would be difficult to pass by this place. A moment later, a man appeared in front of them. The young lady was puzzled as she recognized the man. It was one of the people she saw at the cyclamen residence. Then the man asked the gentleman how he could allow such a weak creature to live. At the same time, he pointed to the young lady. The young lady stared at everyone. She was shocked by everything that happened. Rachiel looked intently at those present and asked what kind of proper upbringing they instilled. He looked at them furiously and said that this was simply ridiculous. Everyone present shouted and pointed at the wizard. They were going to freeze him. The man was furious. He looked at the wizard and said that one should not turn a blind eye to such freedom in relation to the head of the family. Rachiel looked at the man and asked how he could entrust the house to such an idiot. Rachiel looked at everyone present and asked who knew that what his father did to him would be repeated by his own elder brother. For some time he gazed at everyone present. A moment later the young lady began to tremble. Khan looked at the young lady and asked what happened to her. He was very worried. Maybel looked at the destroyed house and saw the punishment room. She became very scared from the memories. Maybel stared at the room and trembled with fear. Her trembling wouldn't go away. Rachiel looked at his brother intently and asked if this was all he had learned from his father. He snapped his fingers and destroyed that room. Rachiel looked at his brother with an angry look and did not say that if he had not sworn to the Emperor, this vile residence would have been destroyed long ago. Rachiel looked at his brother and asked if he should destroy the residence now. Rachiel looked at his brother and said that he of all people should have known that his daughter could not escape. He was shocked and couldn't think that his brother was still acting like this, when he should have understood perfectly well that he shouldn't offend her because Rachiel is capable of a lot. Rachiel looked at his brother with an angry look and said that the price he would have to pay for what he did to his daughter would be very high. Rachiel told his brother that he wouldn't let him get off that easy. The man looked at Rachiel and asked if he understood what he was doing now. He said that Rachiel is now returning to his agreement with the royal family. He said that what Rachiel is doing now is a violation of the contract. The man looked at his brother and said that if he really thought about his daughter, he should be more careful. The man looked at his brother and angrily told him to mean that it was thanks to him that his daughter was now alive. The man looked at his brother with rage and said with a grin that if it weren't for him, his daughter would have ended up like his wife. Rachiel looked at his brother and told him to stop talking. The man was furious. He looked at Rachiel and asked if he thought he didn't know that whenever Rachiel attacked this place, his body would break. He looked at his brother and asked if it was true. Maybel looked closely at her father. She was trembling with fear as she did not know when this would all end. The man looked at his brother and said that they say about him that he is a great wizard of the new generation, a wise young man and a genius. The man said that they talk about Rachiel so much that it becomes sickening. Rachiel, unfortunately, was constrained by enormous restrictions. He was bound by chains that appeared due to the fact that he attacked his relatives and cyclamen. The man looked at his brother and asked if it was possible that this was the agreement he had made with the Emperor that had led to his separation from his daughter. The man looked at his brother with a smirk and said that all this was the result of his own actions. The man mocked his brother and said that with such a damned body he could not do anything. He looked at him and angrily said that he would just watch until Rachiel went crazy. Rachiel looked closely at his daughter and said with a smile that this agreement was terminated the moment his daughter found it. The man looked at his brother and said that this was completely absurd, since the pacts of the royal family were absolute. He looked at Rachiel and asked who would believe him. Moments later, he was attacked, but the wizard dodged the attack and only looked at everyone present with a grin. Ira looked at the wizard and said that no matter how angry he was to be like this, she looked at him and said with a grin that, just like her husband said, he was a magically stupid man, whether they are in the past or in the present. Ira directed her magic at the wizard, but he parried the blow with lightning speed and she fell. Ira was furious. She looked at Rachiel and said with rage that the daughter he left in the cyclamen residence was completely useless. Ira screamed with rage that the young girl was simply pathetic. Ira looked at Rachiel and said with rage that they had been taking care of his clueless daughter for over 10 years. Throughout the conversation, the wizard dealt blow after blow. Ira looked at the wizard and said with rage that, although she knew that he could not take her, she cared for her, believing that he would return someday. She was furious and did not understand how he could be so stupid and reject their God's grace. The wizard was shocked. He looked at her and asked what kind of God's grace and care they gave to his daughter. Rachiel looked at her and said that only garbage was pouring out of her filthy mouth. With the speed of lightning, he directed all his power towards her. A loud roar erupted. Ira recoiled and fell, shaking furiously. The man looked at his brother and said that he had always been like this since early childhood. He looked at his brother and said that all this wealth and honor, and even being called a genius, was not enough to satisfy him. He said that Rachiel ignored him and thought he was superior to everyone. He angrily told Rachiel that they would now see how long he could continue to act like this without permission. The man looked at his brother and said angrily that this is the capital and the imperial army will arrive here soon. He looked at Rachiel and asked with a smirk if he could even resist them. The man looked at his brother and asked what if he beat his stupid daughter. Rachiel was furious at his brother's words. Rachiel looked at his brother and said that his pointless tirade had gone on for too long. Rachiel approached his brother, closer and closer. The man trembled with every step. The man looked at his wife and called her. He screamed that his head hurt. Rachiel looked at his brother and asked how about burying those who mistreated his daughter with this land. Maybel stared at her father. She saw the chains that enveloped him. The young lady was puzzled because she had seen the chains and they seemed very strange to her. She didn't know what it was, but all her instincts told her she needed to identify her father. With the speed of lightning, she rushed towards him. Khan blocked the young lady's path and asked her to wait a little. A moment later, the young lady saw snow. Khan looked sideways at the young lady and said that his master uses powerful magic that can affect the weather. Khan looked at the whirlwind that was rising and said that it was calling on last winter. Khan looked at the whirlwind, puzzled, and said that this was not very good. Khan said that if the gentleman overdoes it, things could end badly. The young lady looked at the butler and asked if the chains that were wrapped around her father were dangerous. Khan looked at the young lady and said that they were dangerous, because the Lord should not use so much mana. After all, he is still bound by restrictions. Kang looked at the young lady and said that, with all due respect, he would like to ask her something. The butlers timidly asked which room his master was in. The young lady said in a trembling voice that this was the room where her mother beat her. Kang was shocked as he stared at the young lady. He asked in rage how they could do this to her. The other wizards, in turn, prepared to repel Rachiel's blow. The man looked at his wife and asked them all to hold out a little longer. Rachiel repelled their defenses and broke their staves. Ira looked at the wizard intently and fearfully. She trembled heavily and could not say anything. She was shocked by everything that was happening. The closer the wizard approached her, the heavier her breathing became. A moment later, the wizard knocked the staff out of her hands. Ira was confused. The wizard looked intently and angrily at Ira and asked with rage what she was doing with his daughter. Ira said in a trembling voice that she did nothing at all. Rachiel looked at her closely and asked what kind of room it was then. Rachiel looked at her and directed a flow of magic. Ira was shaking and said it was a simple room and she didn't do anything at all. She trembled furiously and said with rage that she really didn't understand what she was talking about. The wizard looked at her, and he asked why he shouldn't treat her the same way she treated his daughter. Ira was shaking with fear. Rachiel glared at Ira and said with a smirk that he believed she would have no objections to that. A moment later, the wizard was enveloped in a whirlwind. Khan looked at the young lady and said that these were the worst people he had ever met. He said that because of their insatiable thirst, wealth, and inferiority complex towards their master, they treated her poorly. Kang looked at the young lady and asked if it had been hard for her all these 10 years. Maybel knew he was right, and they were terrible people. But still, she couldn't let her father get hurt. The young lady looked closely at the butler and said that she was not going there for her adoptive parents. A moment later, she entered the vortex. Maybel glared at the butler and said it was because those chains looked like they were hurting her father. She desperately wanted to help him and didn't want him to suffer. Maybel was shaking and she was very cold, but still she continued to go to her father. A moment later, she saw her father. The young lady called him. The wizard shuddered and turned to his daughter. He was surprised that she came in a way he didn't expect to see. The young lady looked at her father and said that she had come to see him. She didn't know what she needed to do to install it. She didn't know if she should tell him that she didn't like it when he left her alone. She came closer to him and in a trembling voice said that she was very cold. Her lips trembled furiously, not because she was afraid of him, and because of the frozen ground and wind. She hoped her father had understood her correctly. The wizard looked at her in surprise. He was shocked by her appearance. A moment later he nodded and said, puzzled, that it was dangerous to be here. The young lady looked at her father and said that she wanted to go home. The wizard was surprised and looked at the destroyed house. She looked at him and pointed with her finger where she wanted. The wizard turned around and saw his house. Maybel looked at him and said with a smile that she wanted to go home with him. A moment later, she saw flower petals on her hands instead of cold snow. Maybel looked in surprise at the flowers that were pouring from the sky. A moment later, she rushed towards her father with the speed of lightning. She hugged him tenderly. The wizard, in turn, looked at his daughter in surprise. A moment later, he called her. Maybel, without looking away from him, asked him to return home together. She said that she would like to eat a lot of cookies there and drink delicious tea with him. Rachiel looked tenderly at his daughter and said that they would go home together. Rachiel looked at his daughter and quietly asked her forgiveness for being cold. The next day, the maids politely attended to the young mistress. Maybel looked at the sister maids and asked with a smile when they knew she had woken up. Riza looked at the young mistress with tenderness and said with a smile that they felt her breathing change. Maybel was a little embarrassed because she did not expect such an answer. Riza looked at the young lady and asked her not to turn her head, otherwise her hair would not be beautiful. Maybel looked at the maid in confusion and asked for forgiveness. Riza looked at the young mistress with a smile and said that she had completely mastered it. Riza looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that even if you just braid it, it looks charming. Maybel looked at the maid and said that her hair looked really great. A moment later, Maybel began to eat. The young lady noticed that the northern residence is calm today. Khan came closer to her and said that the next dessert was lemon pie. While she was eating it, everything seemed very strange. A deafening elemental roar echoed in her head. It seemed to her that she heard him as clearly as yesterday. Kang looked at the young lady and said that he could cool her tea so she could drink it. Her thoughts were far away. When she closed her eyes, the image of the dilapidated cyclamen mansion popped up in her head. The maids and butlers brought tea to the young lady, but did not even say a word about the incident, as if nothing had happened. Most likely, for them what happened was in the order of things. When she saw her adoptive parents sprawled on the ground, she felt nothing. She thought that most likely a good child would think differently. Maybel wondered if she could be somehow strange. The young lady pushed her thoughts away and called the butler. A moment later, she saw that there was no one in the room except her. She was surprised and called the butler again. Bellerophon appeared out of nowhere and looked at the young lady. A moment later, he greeted her. He looked at the young mistress with a smile and said that if she was looking for the butler, he would go away for a while to get some water. The young lady was embarrassed, and she said that, of course, she was looking for him, but she would wait. A moment later, she greeted her friend. The young man looked at the young lady and with a smile asked her forgiveness for his sudden appearance. The young lady smiled shyly and said that everything was fine and he shouldn't worry. Maybel looked at the young man and asked, embarrassed, whether he had had breakfast or not. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he had already eaten. A moment later, he said that it was true that it would be more correct to say that he had already had lunch rather than breakfast. Maybel knew that there was pure magical energy in the air in the morning. Many wizards wake up early for the benefit of meditation. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she had never been able to meditate. Instead, she was forced to cram formulas. She knew she wasn't going to go back to this anymore. She knew it would be better this way. The young lady smiled a beautiful smile and wished him a good day. The young man was surprised. He looked at the young mistress in fascination. Bellerophon noticed something strange. Maybel looked to the side in surprise as she noticed that Abel had come to her. Abel looked at the young lady or said with a smile that it was him. Abel looked at the young lady and asked how she was feeling today. The young lady was a little embarrassed and said that she felt fine today. She also thanked him for his concern. Abel looked at the young lady and said with a smile that it was very good that she was fine. Maybel was shocked as she noticed that he had very cute and playful ears. Unbeknownst to herself, she reached out because she wanted to stroke him. She noticed that his ears were the color of clover syrup. The young lady withdrew her hand with lightning speed as she remembered that he had once told her that she should not touch his ears. Abel looked at her in surprise and asked why she removed her hand. Abel smiled a wide smile and said that she needn't be afraid and could touch his ears. He smiled and said that she could consider everything today to be her special permission, so she could touch it. For several minutes, the young lady affectionately stroked his ears and head. At the same time, Abel playfully waved his tail. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She slowly stroked his head and saw how much he liked it. He smiled shyly at her. A moment later, she remembered that her friend was still there. Maybel was a little puzzled, as she had completely forgotten about his presence. Maybel looked at him sideways. Bellerophon, in turn, only sighed heavily. He didn't like what the young lady was doing at all. Abel came closer to Maybel and asked if she was feeling well today and if she was okay. He said she had a strange look on her face all day today. Bellerophon looked at Abel and said that with his manners you need to keep your mouth shut. Bellerophon looked away and said that the young man was simply ignorant. Abel looked at him and asked why he cared what and how he said. Abel said that he only cared about those whom he recognized as successors. Bellerophon looked at Abel and said that unfortunately this was not his level of knowledge. Abel was furious. He looked at the young man and asked what he said. Abel looked at the young man with fury and said that he recognizes only one master. Abel looked at the young man and asked furiously why he was pretending to be friendly in front of the young lady. Abel said that he knew who Bellerophon really was. Bellerophon came closer to them and said that at least he was not as ignorant as Abel. Abel looked at the young man and angrily told him not to be smart just because he was a year older than him. Maybel was a little puzzled that the young man was a year older, because she thought he had a lot more. The young lady looked intently at the young people and was perplexed. She didn't understand why they started arguing. A moment later, there was a loud crash. Maybel and Abel looked at each other in bewilderment. They were puzzled and did not understand where the noise was coming from. Bellerophon turned around and said that someone had come to the front door. Abel was a little puzzled. He said that he would immediately go and have a look. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and asked if she would like to go and have a look. He smiled and said that Khan would be there too. At the front door of the estate, a man shouted to the wizard. He shouted to Rachiel that he had come to him to take his daughter. The man looked at the butler and asked if he should not call his master. The man asked the butler if he was really going to let his guest stand at the door for so long. Bellerophon and Maybel stood at the column and quietly watched the conversation. Maybel was shocked. She didn't know who this person was, since it was the first time she had seen him. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise. A moment later, he looked at her and quietly told her not to move or make a sound. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why she could not move. He looked at her and said with a smile that if she moved, the magic would dissipate. He smiled and said that they needed to sit quietly, because they will be able to hear the entire conversation. The young lady was very surprised and embarrassed, as she did not know if it was his voice. She noticed that when he spoke to Abel, his voice was cold. Kang looked at Mr. Cayley and said, puzzled, that he couldn't do it. The butler looked at Mr. Cayley and said that not only did he come suddenly and break the main entrance door, but he was also screaming. Khan was furious with the man's behavior. He said that even thugs from dirty alleys don't behave like that. Cayley looked at the butler with a grin and asked what kind of excuses he was making now. The man said with a grin that it looked like the butler had aged quite a bit. Cayley said with a grin that he thought Khan would fly up to him right away. Khan looked at the gentleman with a puzzled expression and told him not to talk nonsense. Khan looked at Cayley and asked if he could take him out the front door now. The man said that he had come to his owner. A moment later, he said that the butler could call his daughter. Khan looked at him and said that she didn't have even a couple of minutes of free time. Khan looked at him and asked if he would call the young mistress. The butler said he thought he should be careful what he wishes for. Quick as lightning, Cayley turned around with a grin on his face. Maybel was a little puzzled. She thought that most likely the man wanted to start a fight. She was very wary, because she suspected that the butler might get hurt. She knew that she had to go out. A moment later, she heard his father's voice. She was very glad that he came out. Rachiel looked at everyone present and asked what was happening here. To celebrate, the young lady called her father. A moment later, she brought up her oversight. Because she shouldn't have talked. The young lady was puzzled and didn't know if the magic could dissipate now. Cayley looked at the wizard with a grin and asked if he really deigned to come out to him. He said with a grin that they had not seen each other for a long time. Rachiel angrily asked the man what he was doing here. From such a cold and angry question from her father, Maybel felt uneasy. She began to tremble without knowing it. Bellerophon hugged the young lady and gently told her that everything would be fine, and she didn't need to worry about anything. Cayley looked at the wizard and said with a smile that he just wanted to visit his old friend. He smiled and said that he did not come here empty-handed. A moment later, he threw a bag of vegetables onto the floor. He looked at the wizard and asked if he would like to take a look, since he himself grew these vegetables and took care of them. He smiled and said that the vegetables from the vegetable fields are bon kaili. Rachiel looked at him with an angry look and said with contempt that he didn't care. After this answer, the man drooped. Cayley looked at the wizard and told him to listen to him, since he could not treat him like that. Cayley looked at the wizard and said with a grin that the rumors had already spread like wildfire. The wizard looked at the man in surprise and asked what rumors he was talking about. Kylie looked at the wizard and asked with a smile if he really thought that no one would know about this. He smiled and told the wizard that this was not at all like him. Kylie looked at Rachiel and said with a grin that he had made his move, and now, because of his irrational actions, he was being closely monitored by the heads of all states. Kylie looked at the wizard and asked if he was aware. Kaylee looked at the wizard and said that he had put pressure on the imperial family after all. Kylie asked the wizard when the uprising would begin. He said the story of his visit to the residence, when he broke his vow and turned everything upside down there, spread in just one day. The wizard looked at him and said that there will always be flies listening to empty gossip. He looked at the man with contempt and said that he must be one of the flies. Kylie laughed after such words from the wizard. He looked at the wizard and asked if he wasn't interested in knowing how the wizard, whom he kicked his fat ass, was doing. Kylie looked at the wizard and said that this all certainly concerns his daughter. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't know whether she should listen to their conversation. She was worried that if she continued to listen, something might happen. The young lady glanced sideways at her friend. The young man looked at the young lady and asked with a smile what happened. Maybel looked at him and asked, puzzled, if she could be here. Bellerophon looked at her and said with a smile that everything was fine and she could listen to their conversation. The young man smiled and said that there was no place where she could not go. He looked closely at the young mistress and said that everything here belongs to her. The young man looked at her intently and wanted to continue, because he wanted to tell her something, but he hesitated and did not tell her anything. The young lady was puzzled. She did not know what he wanted to tell her. She was a little upset because she didn't hear, because his voice was too quiet. She looked at the young man confused and intently. The young lady looked at her friend and asked what he just wanted to say. But a moment later she saw her father. Maybel was puzzled. She hoped that thanks to magic everything would be fine. She noticed his stern look. The young lady glared at her father, his stern gaze telling her that things were going to be bad. The youth stood up and bowed with the speed of lightning, and a moment later he greeted his teacher. Rachiel saw that his daughter was holding on to the young man. He was surprised and did not understand why she was doing this. Maybel looked at her father and realized that she had made a mistake. She didn't even notice how she was holding on to her friend. A moment later, she released him and walked away from him a little. Rachiel continued to glare at the young people. Maybel was perplexed and did not understand why her father did not tell her anything and simply continued to look at her intently. A moment later, she took her friend's hand. At that moment, she saw her father's fierce gaze, and I was a little puzzled. She understood why he was looking at her like that. She got scared and let go of her friend's hand. Rachiel slowly silks the young people. Kylie walked closer to the young lady and asked with a smile if she was the wizard's daughter. Bellerophon shielded the young mistress and looked at the man. The young man looked at him and asked, "Why don't he introduce himself first?" A moment later, the man introduced himself. Kylie looked at the young man and said that his face was smooth. Bellerophon looked at the man and thanked him for the flattering praise addressed to him. Kaylee looked at the young mistress and said with a puzzled grin that she really didn't look like a wizard. The young lady was shocked and cowered at his words. A moment later, her heart sank from such painful words. Kylie looked at the young lady and wanted to say that she looked more like her mother than a wizard, but he hesitated and did not say. A moment later, he looked at her and asked if she could tell him her name. The young lady was a little puzzled. Maybel was confused and didn't know if she could introduce herself to the man. Kylie looked at her and asked if she liked handsome guys. The wizard looked at the man and said that he was too noisy here. The wizard looked at the guest with contempt and anger and said that his daughter would not tell him her name. The wizard used his magic on the guest, and no one heard his voice again. The young lady was a little puzzled. She thought that maybe it was just her who couldn't hear his voice. Rachiel hurriedly approached his daughter. A moment later, he picked up his daughter, and she was in his arms. The young lady clung tightly to her father. He looked at her and asked if it was her habit of wrinkling his clothes. Maybel was taken aback because she realized that she had made a mistake. She looked at him and said that everything was not like that at all. With lightning speed, she let go of his clothes. The wizard looked at her and said that he had not told her to let him go at all. Maybel grabbed his clothes again. Bellerophon laughed as he was amused by the behavior of the father and daughter. Father and daughter looked at the young man in surprise. The young man looked at the young mistress with fanaticism and said that she had done a good job. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand what he was talking about. She knew that she had many questions, but still she could not ask her father. The young lady was not afraid of her father, but she still felt a little awkward. Kylie looked at the wizard and asked if he thought this was too much. Kylie looked at him and asked if this is really how they greet a friend they haven't seen for a long time. Kylie was furious. He shouted that such behavior from the wizard was unacceptable. A moment later, he told the wizard to give him his daughter. Kylie looked at the wizard and said that he had a very lovely daughter, and he also asked how about introducing her to his son. Rachiel looked at the butler and said that he came here to talk. A moment later, the wizard told his butler to lock the door when the uninvited guest left. The butler looked at his master and said that he understood him. Rachiel looked at Kylie and said that he would face lifelong exile. Kylie was shocked. He looked at the wizard and asked him to wait a minute and not leave. Kylie looked at Rachiel and said that he hadn't even gotten to the point yet. A moment later, he had a sword in his hands. Kylie looked at the wizard and asked him to listen to what he had to tell him. The wizard did not look at the man and used his magic on him. Kylie shouted in a hurry that the imperial palace had sent him an invitation. Rachiel looked at the man and asked why the imperial palace sent him an invitation. Kylie looked at the wizard and asked with a grin if he really didn't know. Kylie looked at the wizard and asked him to think, okay. He looked at him and asked why they called someone who quietly farmed for himself. Kylie looked at the wizard and said that he should also receive an invitation soon. The wizard looked at the man in bewilderment and asked when he should receive it. The young lady looked at her father in bewilderment. She didn't understand what they were talking about. A moment later, they saw a light. The young lady was surprised because she noticed that there was a letter inside the glow. Rachiel used magic to receive the letter. A moment later, the letter was in his hands. The young lady looked at her father in bewilderment. After they received the letter, everyone gathered in the hall to discuss it. A moment later, the young lady saw a picture that was covered with a cloth. Kylie looked at his friend and said that this was an international invitation. The young lady shuddered and covered her ears as the man was talking very loudly. Kylie looked at her friend and said that he didn't mean to say anything like that. The wizard looked sideways at his daughter. He noticed that she was uncomfortable. Rachiel looked at the man and told him to close his mouth because his ears hurt. Kylie looked at his friend in surprise and asked if the EMU was saying that. The butler looked at the man and said that he thought the gentleman said it was for him. Kylie looked at his friend and said, puzzled, that he was sorry it sounded too loud. A moment later, he said that still nothing could be done about the international invitation, and they had to go. Kylie looked at his friend, puzzled, and said that he would like to tell him not to even try to insist that he would not go, since violating an imperial order is treason. For a moment, a depressing atmosphere reigned in the room. Rachiel looked at the man intently. A moment later, the wizard, looking at the man, asked since when the hero of the Teftal War became an imperial dog. Kylie looked at his friend and said that their expedition won the last war and they became heroes, and one of them took the imperial throne in the palace, after which they swore allegiance to their emperor. Each of them was obliged to sacrifice what they valued most. This became a guarantee so that they would not dare against him. Otherwise, he will destroy it. Kylie looked at the wizard and said that it was not good to ignore the call of the imperial family, and even if the oath associated with his brother Cyclamen was broken, he has another one. The wizard looked at his friend and said that it didn't matter. The man looked at his friend and sighed heavily. He said this is not the first time. Kylie looked at his friend and asked if he knew the value of the oath. Kylie looked at his friend and said that the price of his oath was his daughter. A moment later, the wizard looked intently and angrily at his friend. Kylie, in turn, shuddered from the ominous aura that emanated from the wizard. Kylie looked at the wizard and said that he should know the price of refusal. He smiled and said that children really like festivals. He said that his daughter probably also received an international invitation. Kylie looked at the young lady and asked her name. The daughter and father looked at each other. The young lady said uncertainly that her name was Maybel. Kylie looked at the young lady and said that she had a very beautiful name that suited her well. The wizard looked at his friend and said with rage that if he said such nonsense, he would tear out his tongue. Kylie was taken aback. He looked at the young lady and asked if she knew what an international festival was. The young lady began to tremble. She looked at the man and said uncertainly that she knew. She always had to study in the punishment room. As for the day the country was founded, she had no choice but to listen to stories from Claudel. The day when you can see sweets from all over the world on the shelves. On this day there is not a single vile person on the streets. The young lady looked at her brother and asked if she could go to the international festival too. The young man looked at her with a grin and asked where she was going. He looked at her and pushed her like lightning, telling her she was trash. The young lady flew down the steps. A moment later she fell with a crash. Her brother looked at her and said with contempt that she was worthless because she did not know any magic. Maybel realized that even if her brother didn't do this, she still wouldn't be able to get to the international festival. She knew that her adoptive parents would never let her go to the festival. The young lady cowered and shook with fear. Kang looked at the young lady and said that she was scared. Kylie was shocked and very puzzled. He looked at the butler and asked if she was scared because of him. With the speed of lightning, the maids approached her and hugged her tenderly. The maids looked at the man and said that he scared their young lady, while bulging his eyes at her. They looked at their master and all nodded together and said that he was a very scary person. Khan looked at the master and said that the maids would not lie. The wizard looked at the man with fury and asked everyone present if they really wanted to say that the man had threatened his daughter. Kylie was very frightened and told the wizard to encourage him, since he did not threaten his daughter at all. The young lady looked at her father and called out to him, but unfortunately her father did not react in any way to the fact that she called him. A moment later she called him again while tugging at his clothes. The young lady looked at her father and asked in a trembling voice if they could go to the international festival. Rachiel shuddered as he did not expect such a question. The wizard was shocked by this question and looked at his daughter very closely and in surprise. The young lady was confused. She didn't know if she had made some kind of mistake. A moment later, she quickly turned around and sat down, lowering her head. She thought that she had made a big mistake after all, asking this question to your father. She realized that he still didn't like this question. She knew she shouldn't have asked him that at all. A moment later, Rachiel looked at her with a smile and asked if she really wanted to go to the festival. The young lady lowered her eyes to the floor and began to finger her fingers. She was a little nervous. In a trembling voice, she said that she didn't want to just go to the residence. Rachiel looked at his daughter in surprise after hearing about the residence. The young lady said in a trembling voice that it was just that her brother always went to the international festival. The young lady recalled how her brother had fun when he was going to an international festival. She said in a trembling voice that she understood perfectly well and knew that someone like her could not go to the festival since she did not belong there at all. The wizard looked at his daughter, puzzled. A moment later, he said they could go. The young lady jumped up from her chair as she was very surprised. Kylie was shocked. He looked at the wizard and asked what he was talking about, since a moment ago, he said himself that he did not want to go to the international festival. Kylie looked at the wizard puzzled and said that this means that people can change. The young lady looked at the man in surprise. A moment later, Kaylee smiled and said that was very good. He looked at the wizard and asked if it was true. Kang looked at the young miss and said with a smile that this was wonderful. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand what he was talking about. The butler smiled and said that she would go to the international festival. He looked at her and said that she really wanted to go. Maybel looked at the butler embarrassedly and asked uncertainly whether it was really that noticeable. The butler looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she was too excited. The young lady became embarrassed. A moment later, she said that she actually really wanted to go to the international festival. The butler looked at the young man and asked if he would take the lady to her room. The young man nodded and agreed. A moment later, the young man used his magic and they were transported. The young lady sighed heavily. The young man looked at her and asked if she was really very scared. He also asked if she had any pain after the move. She looked at him and said with a smile that it was not that simple at all. It was amazing. Bellerophon smiled sheepishly and said that he was very glad that she was okay. The young lady looked at the young man and said that he had previously told her that he was her father's student. Maybel looked at her friend and asked when he became one. Bellerophon looked at the young mistress with a puzzled expression and said that he did not know. More precisely, He does not remember the exact time. He looked at her and said with a smile that it must have been from early childhood that he became his student. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that he was still studying, but he could catch any animal for her. A moment later, he used magic. The young lady was puzzled. She looked at him intently, as she did not understand what he was doing now. Bellerophon looked at the young mistress and asked if she liked cute animals. The young lady smiled and nodded. Bellerophon P looked at the young mistress and asked if she could extend her hands to him. Suddenly, she saw a kitten. The young man looked at the young lady and asked if she liked it. Maybel, puzzled, said no. A moment later, a whirlwind formed on her arm. With the speed of lightning, the kitten turned into a long-tailed tit. Bellerophon smiled and said that everything was correct, and it was a tit. The young man looked at the young lady and said that he saw how surprised she was, and he decided to change his uniform to a more friendly one. The young man looked at the young lady and asked if she liked birds. Maybel looked at him shyly and said that she loved him. Bellerophon smiled and said with a smile that he was very glad that she liked the bird. The young lady loved birds very much from early childhood. On their wings they can fly anywhere. When her brother found out that she liked the bird, he looked at her with contempt. Claudel told his sister that only a person like her likes such things. Weak, insignificant, ugly birds. Of course, her brother was very unhappy about this. The young lady brushed away the memories that briefly popped into her head. She looked at her new friend and asked if the bird was a gift. The young man looked at her and said that this was his gift to her. He smiled and asked if she liked it. Maybel looked at him and said with a smile that she liked it. Bellerophon looked at the beautiful bird and said with a smile that the bird seemed to really like its new owner. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and asked if she knew what a mark was. He said marking is when an animal recognizes its mother or its owner. He smiled and said that sometimes this happens to people too, and just now this bird recognized her as its owner. The young lady looked at her friend and thanked him with a smile. She said she would definitely treasure it. Bellerophon looked at the young lady with confusion and said that he would be very grateful to her. Laura looked at the young mistress and asked if she was happy. Riza looked at Maybel and asked if that was amazing. Riza smiled with joy and said that they would go to an international festival today. Laura smiled and said that everything was right. A moment later, she said that today was the day the young lady had been looking forward to. The young lady looked at the maids with confusion and said that she didn't expect everything to happen so quickly. Scylla looked at her sisters and the young mistress. She was perplexed and did not understand why they were talking for so long. Scylla moved closer to her sister and touched her cheek tenderly. She smiled and told her sister not to bother her mistress. Scylla looked at the young lady and asked if she was ready. Maybel smiled and said she was ready. Scylla looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that the beta boarded the crew first. She also said that the master would soon approach the young lady. The young lady slowly walked into the carriage, but a moment later she saw that her father was already sitting next to her. She was a little surprised because she didn't expect to see him so quickly. The young lady looked timidly at her father. She wanted to call him Dad, but hesitated and didn't finish. The wizard looked at his daughter in surprise and asked why she could not say this. The young lady hesitated and timidly said that she was a little shy. Maybel spoke at him so many times, but she still felt awkward. Rachiel looked at his daughter and snowily told her that she should not be afraid. He smiled and stroked her head affectionately. A moment later, they rose into the air and the carriage and horses were floating in the air. The young lady was surprised, as she had never seen anything like this before. She looked out the window with admiration and asked her father if they were really flying in the air. She looked sideways at her father and said with a smile that it was just magic. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said with a smile that they had already arrived at the place. A moment later, he asked her if she wanted to look around. The young lady was a little puzzled. Maybel woke up and asked if they had already arrived. She didn't expect them to arrive so quickly. The young lady jumped up with lightning speed and stood on her feet. A moment later, Rachiel was carrying his daughter in his arms. A moment later, the young lady saw a square where there were a lot of people. She also heard a very loud sound. Looking up at the sky, she saw fireworks. She looked at everyone in surprise and joy. A moment later, a young girl approached them. She smiled and welcomed them to the international festival. The young girl smiled and wished them a good time. She had flowers in her hands and offered them to Maybel. Maybel was a little puzzled because she didn't expect anyone to give her a flower. A moment later, she looked at the flower in confusion. She was very happy. Her father looked closely at his daughter and asked if she liked it. She smiled and said that she really liked it. At the same time, she called him Dad. Rachiel looked away in embarrassment. Maybel looked at Scylla and asked in surprise why Abel did not go with them. Scylla looked at the young mistress and said that Abel was protecting the house. Scylla looked at the young mistress and said that their master told him to protect the residences. Laura and Riza looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that they believed it was an order. Scylla smiled and wished the young lady a good time. She said with a smile that they would now go and distribute their luggage. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if he would come with them. Bellerophon smiled and said that he would go. Bellerophon looked at the young mistress and said with a smile that he should not leave the teacher in the capital. Rachiel looked at the student and daughter and said that it was time for them to go. The young people agreed. Maybel looked closely at her father. She was perplexed because she did not understand why his student should follow the teacher. They walked around the square and all kinds of shops. The young lady was very happy since she had never been to an international festival before and had not felt such a pleasant atmosphere. She was very glad that she could walk carefree and have fun with her family. A moment later, she heard a loud sound. The young lady looked dumbfounded in the direction where the sound came from. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that she was now seeing a giant wooden doll of the Western Duchy, and she is called Ninel. The young lady was surprised as she had never seen anything like this before. The wizard looked at his daughter and said with a smile that it was a giant wooden doll that moved with magic. The young lady looked closely at her father and said that the doll must be very heavy. While passing by various shops, the young lady noticed a beautiful and delicious one, the aroma of which beckoned. The young lady saw a saleswoman who was smiling and inviting customers to her. She told people not to pass by and come to her to try her delicious cookies. The saleswoman smiled and said that she also had apple pies, strawberry pies, and meat pies in her assortment. The saleswoman smiled and handed the young lady a treat. She smiled and greeted them. Maybel accepted the treat and thanked the saleswoman. The saleswoman looked at the young lady and asked if she was here with her dad. Maybel, eating the treat, nodded and said that she came to the international festival with her father. The saleswoman smiled and said they arrived just in time. She said with a smile that in their store, customers can spray star powder. The saleswoman looked at the young lady and said that she was now sprinkling the magic powder on the cookies, and now they would become simply magnificent. The saleswoman smiled and said that the young girl could give the cookies to people she liked. Maybel looked at her father and asked with a smile if he liked these cookies. The wizard looked at his daughter in surprise and said that there was nothing special about it. Maybel looked at Khan and Bellerophon and said that she would like to treat them to cookies. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he would eat all the cookies himself. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said, puzzled, that come to think of it, he really adores cookies. The young lady was a little surprised. Khan, in turn, looked at the master dumbfounded. He didn't expect this. Bellerophon laughed quietly next to him. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he even liked cookies too much. Khan looked sideways at his master and said that he did not know whether he would dare to tell him this, but this was too much. Rachiel, in turn, looked intently at the butler and did not answer. He looked at the gentleman and was puzzled, and said that he also liked cookies. The young lady looked at her father. She was puzzled that Kang also liked cookies. She didn't know what to do now, because her father ate the cookies with gusto and didn't share them with anyone. Maybel glanced sideways at the saleswoman who still had cookies in her tray. A moment later, she took the cookie and offered it to the butler. Kang was shocked. He looked at the young lady and thanked her. Kang did not have time to take the cookie when suddenly his master intercepted the cookie and took it for himself. He looked at his daughter and said that she didn't have to give him cookies. He looked at the butler threateningly and said that he did not like to eat cookies. The young lady looked at her father, puzzled, and said that the butler had previously said that he liked cookies. Rachiel looked at Maybel and said that was a lie. The lady looked closely at her father. She noticed that he was eating the cookies with gusto. She thought it was very tasty, since he liked it. Khan was shocked because the gentleman had falsely accused him. Khan looked at his master and asked, since when did he hate cookies? The wizard looked closely at his daughter and, with a soft smile, asked her to leave for a while, as he needed to talk to the butler. Maybel saw her father drag the butler somewhere in a different direction. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and asked her if everything was okay. The young lady looked at her companion, puzzled, and said that everything was fine. The young lady thought for a while because she didn't know if it was good to eat cookies at lunchtime. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said that this was very good, as she looked very happy. Maybel looked at her friend confused. She actually looked very happy as she was spending time with her loved ones. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if he would like to have a cookie. The young man was surprised. He looked at the young lady and asked if she was really giving him cookies. She smiled and said that it was. Maybel said with a smile that it was great to eat cookies together. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that if he eats this cookie, she won't get it. Maybel stared at her friend. She didn't expect him to behave this way. She thought he would take the cookies for himself. They looked at each other intently for several minutes. Bellerophon looked closely at the young lady, and the scroll said that this way they could try the cookies together. The young lady was very confused. She did not understand what was going on. She was very embarrassed because the young man was very close to her. The young man looked at the young ladies and said with a smile that he ate it very quickly so that the master would not catch him. Young ladies passing by looked intently at the young man. They thought he was a very handsome boy. Yulia was chillingly whispering frantically behind his back, and they discussed his beauty. The young man was a little embarrassed, and with the speed of lightning he pulled away the hood. The young man looked at the young lady with a scribble and said that he should have been more careful. Maybel looked at her friend in surprise and asked if he didn't like people's attention. Maybel looked at him puzzled and asked if he didn't like the festival. The young man looked at the young lady embarrassedly and said with a smile that it wasn't that, he just didn't like too crowded places. He took the young lady's hand tenderly. Bellerophon looked at her and said with a smile that if he spends this festival with the young lady, then everything will be fine. The young lady gazed at the young man. She felt a strange atmosphere. She didn't think he was using magic, but it felt like the world had stopped around them. She looked at him intently and embarrassedly, without taking her eyes off. Rachiel approached them. They all walked leisurely around the square together. On this day and in this place, one could meet wizards from all continents, and here one could also meet mechanics and artisans. At the moment, they were passing through and exploring the largest commodity market. The seller showed the buyer a beautiful mechanical bird. But unfortunately, the bird could not sit in his arms and flew away with the speed of lightning. The seller was shocked. He ran after the bird with lightning speed in order to catch it. It could be seen that goods and tools that did not have magic could not work. Making a magical thing is not as easy as it seems. The young lady was walking around the shop and noticed a strange staff. She looked at him closely as she had never seen anything like this before. She looked at the tool and asked the seller if this method was also a magical item. The seller smiled and asked how she guessed about it. The seller smiled and said that there are almost all magical items in the shop. He smiled and said that the staff was a magical item. He twirled the staff in his hand with a smile. He smiled and said that this is not just a staff. If you hit the ground with it, a miracle will happen. When the seller hit the ground with his staff in the blink of an eye, he disappeared. The young lady was surprised and dumbfounded. She did not expect such magic to happen. A few minutes later, the man was behind the young lady's people. The man smiled and said that this staff could also carry her. He said with a smile that it was a great way to get around. He looked at the young lady and asked if she liked the staff. She was shocked because she did not expect this. The man looked at the young lady and asked if she wanted to try it too. Worried, Maybel said that she had no magic. The man looked at the young lady and said that there was no need to worry as the staff took the mana of the magic crystal so anyone could use it. The young lady looked at the staff a little puzzled. Because I was very worried. Maybel didn't know if she could do it. Khan looked at the man and said that this is a very great thing. The man was proud of his creation. He looked at the butler and said that he was very good at such things. The wizard looked at his daughter and nodded. She realized that she could use the staff. The young lady was very worried. She looked closely at the ambassador because she knew that even if she uses the power of the crystal, using magic means a lot to her. She hit the ground with her staff and a circle formed around her that glowed. She was very surprised. because when the man moved, this did not happen. She looked at everyone present in surprise, because she did not understand why the magic crystal suddenly summoned runes. Everyone was shocked because they did not expect this. They reached out to the young lady with the speed of lightning. But, unfortunately, they did not have time, and the young lady moved. She looked at the area in surprise, because she did not understand where she had ended up. She spun around in surprise as she wanted to take in the area. She didn't understand why she ended up in such a place, and wondered if it was really broken afterwards. But a moment later she realized that it was most likely just fine when the owner showed her how to use it. The young lady was puzzled by everything that was happening, but she knew that first she needed to find her father. A moment later she heard a voice. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she was all right. Unexpectedly, the young lady shuddered, as she did not expect to hear anyone. The young man came closer to her and said that he thought she was in trouble, and he also asked for forgiveness for scaring her. The young man looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if she was really lost. The young man smiled his sparkling smile. He looked at her and extended his hand to her. The young lady was very worried because she was seeing the young man for the first time. He looked at her and asked if she knew where she needed to go. The young lady hesitated and said she didn't know. He looked at her in surprise because he heard that she did not know where to go. The young man looked at the young lady and said that she need not worry. He looked at her and asked if they could introduce themselves to each other first. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that his name was Aslan Justice Kale. The young lady was surprised because she realized that the young man had the same last name as Bon. The young lady looked at the young man. There is a smile and said that he could call her Maybel. Aslan looked at her and said with a smile that she had a beautiful name. Aslan looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he came to this festival with his father, but he went away for a short time. The young lady looked at him and said with a smile that she also came with her father. But, unfortunately, she lost it recently when she was on the market. She lost her eyes for a moment as she drooped. The young man looked at her and asked if the distance she had walked was not large. Wouldn't it be better for them to stay here and not go anywhere? He said that her father was probably looking for her. The young lady was shaking so much that she was very scared. She hoped that her father would find her. She was very scared because she was left alone in the capital and did not know whether she should return to the residence alone. Aslan looked at his new acquaintance and said with a smile that she did not need to worry. He looked at her and said with a smile that her father had lost such a sweet and beautiful daughter like her, so he would definitely look for her with all his might. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such pleasant words. Aslan looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he would certainly do that. He took her hand tenderly. Aslan tenderly took her hand and kissed it. He looked at her and said with a smile that she was beautiful. The young lady was shocked. She did not expect the young man to do something like this. She had previously heard that aristocrats greet ladies by kissing the back of their hands and their palms. She was very embarrassed and thought that, most likely, her new friend was an aristocrat. The young man looked at his new acquaintance and laughed. The young lady took her hand back and suddenly shuddered. She was very confused and did not know what to do or how to behave. A moment later, she heard a familiar voice. Aslan looked at the young lady and asked if she knew this voice. Maybel looked at Aslan and said that she thought it was her butler. Aslan looked sideways at the man who was looking for her and said that he was very happy and confident that her father would soon find her. He smiled and said that in that case he would go. He said with a smile that they would see each other again at the holiday. The young lady was shocked that he was leaving so quickly. She asked him to wait a little. The young man turned around and looked at the young lady. He was at a loss and did not understand why she called him. Maybel looked at the young man with embarrassment and thanked him for helping her. She stared at him just a little longer, and tears would have flowed from her eyes. A moment later, the young man came closer to her and kissed her. He looked at her and said with a smile that she had nothing to thank him for. Aslan looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he did not know. Maybe it's because of his mood, but he thinks that they will definitely meet again. Maybel was shocked. She did not expect this. She looked at the young man intently and in surprise. She looked at him and didn't know what to do now. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that he hoped that they would certainly meet again. A moment later, the young lady began to float in the air. Rachiel looked at his daughter in surprise and called her. A moment later, the young lady was hugging her father tightly, sitting in his arms. He looked at his daughter and said softly that he had finally found her. A few minutes later, Khan and Bellerophon ran up to them, out of breath. Maybel was shocked, as she didn't expect them all to worry about her. Tears welled up in her eyes, because she was very pleased that they took care of her. Aslan looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he was glad that she had finally been found. He smiled and said that they would see each other again. A moment later, he left. Kang approached the young lady and asked for forgiveness. He said that it was entirely his fault. He looked at her and asked if she was very scared. Kang looked at the young lady and asked whether this young man had offended her or not. He asked the young lady if he needed to follow him. The wizard looked at the butler and said that the young man must be taken alive, and he himself will deal with him. The young lady was shocked. She said that it was not like that at all. Sobbing, she said that she was just very upset, because she thought that she would never be able to see them all again. Rachiel looked at his daughter and gently told her not to worry, as he would not lose her again. Crane looked at the young lady and said that she must be very tired today, so they should all go back to the mansion. A moment later, they walked leisurely towards the mansion. Maybel looked at her father and thanked him for saving her and finding her. The wizard looked at his daughter and said tenderly that she did not need to thank him as much as she should take it for granted. Upon entering the estate, the young lady was very surprised. Maybel looked at the maid in surprise and asked if they really had a mansion in the capital. Maybel looked at Scylla and asked if this mansion really belonged to the Cyclamen family. Scylla was a little surprised by such questions. The young lady looked at the maid and said that she was wondering if her brother or other family members were using this mansion. The maid looked at her mistress and said that everything was wrong, since the master bought this mansion especially for her during her stay in the capital. Laura smiled, looking at her mistress, and said that everything was exactly like that, and this mansion was all hers. The maid smiled and said that this is a place where even the royal family cannot enter without permission. In addition, the master took care of the safety of this mansion by installing a magical barrier on it. Scylla looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry about anything. Maybel was very surprised, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady plopped down onto the sofa with lightning speed. A moment later, she saw her bird fly up to her. The young lady looked closely at the bird and began to stroke it gently. She asked the bird where it had been. Maybel looked at the bird tenderly and said that it was a pity that it was not with them at the festival. Bellerophon knocked on the young lady's room and asked if he could come in for a moment. Maybel looked at the front door and told the young man that he could come in. The young man came closer to her and asked for forgiveness for such unexpected concern. The young lady looked at her friend and said with a smile that everything was fine, and he could sit next to her. The young man looked at the young lady and used his magic on the bird. He said with a smile that even if she doesn't see the bird, it is still always next to her. He said that this tit was born from mana, and it was able to hide by itself. The young man smiled and said that the bird was always near her, and so recently, thanks to this bird, he found it. In turn, the bird was very angry, since the young man always hung around his mistress. Maybel looked at her friend in surprise and asked if that meant he had found her. She was very surprised because, of course, she knew that he had magic, but she did not think that he would be able to find it. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that the master cannot freely use magic in the capital. His abilities are limited. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her friend and asked if other wizards could not also use magic in the capital. The young man looked at the young lady and said that everything is wrong, and this only applies to powerful people like the Lord. Bellerophon looked at Maybel and said that his teacher had made a vow. The young lady was a little puzzled. She did not understand why his strength was limited and for what purpose he made the vow. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he had gradually expanded his range as they searched for her. The young man smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that the capital was unusually huge. The young lady started and asked if it was possible. Bellerophon looked away and said that he was still just learning, but if he needed to cover the entire capital, the master would certainly do it. The young lady looked at her friend and said that he had mentioned earlier that her father had limitations on magic. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said that even if his master were mortally wounded, he would do everything possible for his daughter. Maybel was a little puzzled by this answer. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that, fortunately, this did not happen, since her new friend gave him a signal. Bellerophon looked at Maybel and said that when she needed help, this baby would notify him at any time. The young bird became proud and looked intently at its owner. The young lady was shocked. She realized that this was not just a bird, but a little guardian angel. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he was really trying to find her as soon as possible, and he is very glad that he found her so quickly. A moment later, the young lady knocked on the door and was told that the bath was ready. Maybel smiled and said she would be there soon. The maids came closer to them and said with a smile that they would definitely clean everything up now. The young lady thanked them and also thanked her bird for the beautiful flower. The maids were shocked, as they had never seen a bird like this before. They looked at the bird in surprise. With the speed of lightning, they ran up to the young lady. They began to look at the young bird with delight. Unexpectedly, the bird shuddered, as it did not expect such an assertive presence. Maybel looked at the maids and asked if they really knew this bird. Laura said that they know this bird, since this bird belongs to Bellerophon. Riza stared at the bird and told her sister to take a closer look, as it seemed to have a personality. Laura was very surprised. She said that this was no longer simple magic. The bird was shocked and felt tense. Bellerophon had previously used magic to create only small animal messengers who carried out orders. Magic had a similar effect. Mana is the most important thing for a wizard. The young lady was a little puzzled as she didn't understand what they were talking about. She thought that, most likely, the young wizard gave her something great. Laura looked at the young lady and asked if she had given the bird a name. The young lady looked at the maid and said that she had not given her a name yet. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that she needed to wash her face and go to bed quickly. After all, they were only at the opening of the festival, and this is just the beginning. The next day, they walked leisurely around the area. Maybel recently learned that her dad's power in the capital is limited. She didn't know if they could walk for that long. The young lady looked at her father puzzled and called him. Rachiel looked at his daughter in surprise. For a moment he thought about the conversation with his friend. He didn't know what he could do. The only thing he and the heroes received from the imperial family, it was a damn oath. The young lady knew that her daddy's expression was sad from what he heard back then. She felt uneasy. She didn't know how she could help him. She sincerely didn't want to do anything he didn't like. She didn't want to be a burden to him and wanted to stay with him forever. The young lady looked at her father and said with a smile that the festival was really fun, and she had never seen such a large fountain. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said with a smile that the background there was made by the first wizard. He said that the water here never stops flowing, and intervention in nature is a very complex magic, and it is truly great. Kang looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he would like to walk a little more and then have lunch outside. He smiled and said that there is a restaurant here that is famous for its delicious food. Khan smiled and said that this is one of the few restaurants that he likes because of the picky owner. He said that he often visited there when he was called to the capital. Rachiel looked at the butler and said that he was talking too much. The young lady looked at them intently and smiled. A moment later, the young lady heard someone shouting very loudly and inviting everyone to the golem race. Maybel looked at those present in surprise and asked what they were talking about, since she had never heard of any race before. A man walked down the street and shouted to everyone that this was the only chance in their lives. The man said that the visit costs only 5 gold pieces, and participation is 20 gold. The young lady looked at her companions in surprise and asked if the race was really starting again. Khan looked at her and said he thought so. He also said that he heard the rules from 20 years ago are being repealed one by one. The young lady looked at her companions, puzzled, and said that this was supposed to be family fun. Khan looked at her and said that this was just food for the emperor's dogs. Kang said that, however, the imperial family only issues rules that have blind loyalty. The young lady was puzzled. She thought that most likely she had been told the wrong rules. Khan looked at them and said that there was nothing they couldn't do. The young lady was puzzled and asked if everything would be all right. Khan smiled and said that, of course, everything would be fine, and they are ready to do whatever she wants. He smiled and said that for her sake the Lord could make even the sun follow her. The young maid smiled and said that they were ready to tear for her sake. She needs a lot of flowers and trees to pull out, and also provide her with a lot of herbs. Can approached them and asked if they really thought that the young lady wanted their plants. Scylla looked at the butler in surprise and asked what was wrong with the flowers. Bellerophon approached the young lady and said with a smile that she now has the sun, flowers, and trees. He looked away from her in embarrassment and said that perhaps it would be better for him to choose the moon for her. The young lady was a little surprised. Father and daughter looked at the young man in surprise. The wizard looked at his daughter, and in the blink of an eye took her into his arms. He said it was time for them to go. The young man looked at the teacher and said that he was right. Rachiel tenderly closed his daughter's eyes. He smiled and said that she had better close her eyes for a minute, otherwise she might lose her sight. They entered the alley and disappeared moments later. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that she could open her eyes. The young lady was shocked. She stared at the entire city. She was very surprised as they were floating in the sky. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that now she can see the beauty of the entire square. Rachiel looked at his daughter and asked if she liked the view. The young lady was very surprised. She moved closer to her father and said with a smile that she really liked it, and it was very beautiful here. Maybel was very interested to know if it was true that there was such beauty everywhere during the festival. She could no longer think about anything else. The wizard looked at his daughter. He was surprised that she was happy about such little things. Maybel gazed at the beautiful view and said with a smile on her face that she had never seen anything like this before. She smiled and said that there was a festive atmosphere everywhere. The young lady smiled and said that this was truly an amazing place. She thought everything around her was very nice. The young lady smiled and said that it was very spacious. She said that she really likes it when it's free and beautiful. She huddled closer to her father. It seemed to her that the view was reminiscent of a library in a mansion, since it was also very beautiful and spacious. Rachiel looked at his daughter and asked if she wanted him to buy her something. The young lady was surprised and asked what it was all about. Rachiel looked at his daughter and asked if she wanted him to buy her that arena over there. Maybel was shocked because she did not expect her father to offer her to buy something so big. She looked at him and was puzzled and said that she didn't need it. The wizard looked at his daughter and asked if she wanted him to buy her a statue. The young lady said she didn't want to. A moment later, he asked if she wanted him to buy her a golem. Maybel was shocked by such questions, since she did not want this at all. Khan looked at them in surprise. A moment later, he called to his master. Khan looked at the young lady and said, "Sir," that she said that it was not the arena that she liked, but the view from here of the landscape itself. The young lady was very happy that Khan understood what she liked. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that in that case, they would have to take this place. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect her father to say something like that. Khan looked at the gentleman and said that everything was not like that at all. This would not require such a high level of magic. He said that my lady liked the scenery that unfolded. Kang also said that he thought it was still dangerous for the young lady to deal with the golem. The fairy sisters were very happy. Khan looked at his master and asked if he could give the young lady a foal instead of a golem. He looked at the gentleman and asked how he liked this idea. Rachiel was very surprised when the butler said that the young lady could be given a foal. Khan smiled and said that everything was correct, since my lady loves animals very much. Khan looked at her and said that when she saw him and Abel, she was not afraid. Channel smiled and said that my lady felt comfortable around them. Khan smiled and said that he thought the young lady would definitely make friends with any animal, like any wizard. Khan smiled and told the lord that she was his daughter. The young lady looked at the butler in surprise and asked if wizards were really friends with animals. Bellerophon came closer to the young lady, took her hand and said with a smile that this was exactly the case. Wizards make friends with different animals. They do it well because they take their strength from nature. In ancient times, many wizards tamed huge dragons. However, now there are very few of them left. The young lady knew that her dad was a very powerful wizard, but she was a little surprised and puzzled by the fact that he lived in the North Mansion. She didn't know the answer to this question. Bellerophon looked at the mistress and said with a smile that the teacher sometimes tamed animals. He smiled and said that it would be nice to teach my lady to ride horses. Khan smiled and said that probably my lady would do the same. The young lady knew that she would not succeed. Bellerophon looked at her and said with a smile on his face that she would certainly succeed, since there was nothing difficult about it. A moment later, the wizard looked at the young lady and said that everything was decided. Maybel looked at her father in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her and said that he had decided to build a stable for her. Looked at him and said that. Kang looked at the gentleman and said that the young lady did not understand what he was talking about. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that he would certainly build a farm in the residence along with a hippodrome. The young lady was a little surprised. She looked at her father and smoothly looked at the butler. She asked Khan why they needed a hippodrome. Khan looked at the young mistress and said that this was necessary in order to observe the various breeds from the side. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that they needed to sign up for the competition. Khan looked at the young lady and said that it was only about attracting the best. Kang smiled and said that the young lady really likes animals, so this is a good idea, and the choice will not be so difficult. Khan looked at the young lady and said that she could learn to ride horses. The young lady was very surprised. She looked at it and asked if it was really possible to learn it. Khan smiled and said that of course it was possible and she would be free to ride horses, after all the studying. The young lady was very surprised. It seemed to her that this was just some wonderful dream. No one scolded her for not knowing how to use magic. No one mocked or laughed at her. She didn't know if she could really be happy at last. Everyone was very kind to her. Maybel was very surprised and happy, because no one had treated her like that before. Maybel looked at her father and thanked him with a smile. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said with a smile that if she wants to have a huge stable even larger than the imperial palace itself, then she should not be shy. He said that she could tell him anything. Maybel looked at her father confused. She was pleased that he cared about her so much. Rachiel looked at his daughter and softly said that he wanted to buy her all the horses in the world. Curling her fingers, Maybel said that it was too much and very expensive. Rachiel looked at his daughter and told her to stop thinking about it. He smiled and said that he didn't feel sorry for her. A moment later, the maid sisters called the young mistress over. Walking near the shop, Maybel saw an interesting product. She looked at Bellerophon in surprise and asked what it was. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that this is an airy cookie that looks like a cloud. He looked at her and said with a smile that these cookies come in different shapes. The young lady was surprised and said that it seemed very tender. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said that this was a famous delicacy of the Southern Ren Empire. Maybel looked at it and said with a smile that it looked like cotton candy. The lady suddenly remembered moments from her past life, when she was still living with her foster parents. Once upon a time, her brother gave her cotton candy to try. Then cotton candy was very tasty, but when she ate it, she became very sad. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said that she wanted to try the sweetness. The young lady looked at her friend, puzzled. The young man was perplexed. He looked at the young lady and asked if he had made a mistake in his judgment. The young lady grabbed the sweet spice and said with a smile that he was right and she wanted to try it. A moment later, she looked at her friend and asked about the money. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he bought the stall, so she shouldn't worry. The young lady was a little puzzled. One looked at her friend and asked if the seller wouldn't be surprised. The young man took out a whole bag of money and said with a smile that he didn't think the seller would be surprised. He looked at her and said with a smile that during the festival, many wizards appear in their faces, and also a ceremonial congress opens, only for the families of magicians. The young lady was surprised. She did not understand what he was talking about, since she had not heard about the ceremonial congress before. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he was talking about a masquerade ball. The young man said that the imperial family invites many families. A moment later, he said, puzzled, that besides, the emperor did not take no for an answer. The young lady noticed that her friend seemed incredibly sad after he spoke about the celebration. Maybel was a little surprised and didn't understand what she asked wrong. She brought up that it was better for her not to ask about such things. Maybel knew that, for example, it was difficult for her to tell other people that she did not possess magic at all, and yet she knew that every person had at least one thing that was difficult for him to talk about with anyone. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that such an incredible huge street is full of carriages. The young lady was surprised and asked if it was true. The maid smiled and said that it was all true and therefore she should be careful, because every now and then someone gets run over. The young maid smiled and said that there were many dangers in the world, but they would certainly protect her. They smiled and said she didn't need to worry about it. Scylla smiled, looking at the young mistress, and said that if she doesn't know something, then she can ask them any time and anything. The young maid smiled and said that after the appearance of the young mistress Manor, they read a lot of books related to the human world, so they now know a lot of things. The young lady was surprised. She looked at the maids and said that she would definitely do this, but still she wondered why they read books about the human world. Scylla smiled and said that they spent all their time only at the master's estate, so they knew nothing about the outside world, but they wanted her life to be filled only with happy moments. She smiled and said that they wanted to take good care of the young lady. Scylla, looking at the young mistress, smiled and said that it would not hurt to know as much as possible about the world. Therefore, they read and studied all the books that were available about her. Maybel looked at the maid, and with an embarrassed smile, thanked her for her concern. A moment later, they went to the counter. They saw beautiful flowers. Scylla looked at the flower, and later looked at her sisters and said with a smile that she would like to give this youth to her mistress. The young maids discussed the flowers they wanted to give to the young mistress. The seller looked at the young ladies in surprise and with a smile. A moment later, the maids with a full bouquet of flowers ran to the young mistress. They were so happy they wanted to give her a wonderful gift. The seller was shocked. He looked at the young ladies and shouted at them to wait, since they had not paid him the money. A moment later, Bellerophon paid the money for the flowers. The young lady looked at the maids and sheepishly thanked them for the wonderful gift. She looked intently at the bouquet of flowers as she was very surprised. She liked the gift very much, as she felt a pleasant aroma from it. She noticed that the flowers given to her were very similar to Scylla. She thought it might be because the flower was red. Maybel looked at Laura and asked her why Scylla was the eldest. Laura smiled and said that it was all because Sister Bud. The young lady was a little surprised. She looked at the young maid and said that the wind plants begin to grow from the root. A sprout appears from the grain, and then a stem emerges from it. Maybel looked at the maid and asked if Riza shouldn't be older. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that everything was wrong. She said that their sister was the first one to appear, and they differ in their nature. She said that elves and humans are born through reproduction, and nymphs arise from objects or plants. Scylla's heart contains a core. The core is a magical crystal that has absorbed life energy as mana. A support rod grows from the crystal, gradually going lower and lower. After all the explanations, the young lady still understood why Scylla was the elder sister. Laura smiled and said that everyone was just like that and very strong. The wizard can even grant life himself by inserting a core into something. Laura said that a creature born in this way becomes a good friend and ally to such a wizard. The young lady smiled and looked at the maid. She asked if in other words we could say that it was something like a golem. Laura smiled and said that was true. She said that long ago magicians possessed many such golems. The young lady smiled and said that she thought she had read something similar in a magical encyclopedia. Laura looked at the young mistress in surprise and asked if she had actually read about it. The young lady said that it was written there that in objects or plants that you have absorbed magic into, you can meet your magical friend. A moment later, Laura looked at the young mistress and told her to look up since they had already arrived. The young lady looked intently at the butler and at her father. The young lady was very surprised, since she had never seen anything like this before. She noticed that there were a lot of people in the area. The young lady caught a glimpse of a man running at full speed. A man running near the young lady inadvertently pushed her and she staggered. Maybel was shocked because she knew she was going to fall. The man ran up to his friend and asked with a smile if it was his first time at an international festival. With the speed of lightning, the maids approached the young lady and asked if she was okay, and they also asked if she had hurt herself anywhere. Maybel looked puzzled and said she was fine, but unfortunately her flowers had fallen. The maids looked at the mistress in surprise and asked if everything was fine with her. The young lady looked at everyone present, puzzled, and said that they did not need to worry, since pain was nothing new to her. Rachiel looked at his daughter and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, he asked if her shoulder hurt. The young lady was a little puzzled and said with a trembling voice that it was true. A moment later, there was a crash. The young lady was surprised because she realized that, most likely, her father was very angry, and now the same thing could happen again as it happened in the residence where her adoptive parents lived. Maybel called out to her father. A moment later, a man approached them and asked for forgiveness. Rachiel stood up with his daughter in his arms. He looked at the man threateningly. The young lady was puzzled by the whole situation. She knew that if her father used a strong spell, he would suffer greatly because of the agreement. She knew that she definitely had to calm him down. Maybel looked at the man and asked what was the matter. The man came closer to them and said with a smile that he was a friend of the idiot who had just pushed her. The man looked at the young lady and asked if she had suffered an hour from their recent encounter. The man looked sideways at his friend and said, puzzled, that his friend was also a rusher, and he sincerely apologized for him. The man looked at the wizard, puzzled, but told the young lady that it looked like she had come to the festival with her older brother. The man looked at them, puzzled, and said that, however, it was nothing, and he had already apologized. He also said that if she was seriously injured, he would certainly carry out her treatment. Rachiel was very angry. He looked at the man and with contempt asked if he really wanted to pay for the treatment. The wizard looked at the man and asked him if the one with whom he was now talking so brazenly knew. The young lady looked at the man and said that he was not her elder brother. She said that he is her father. Rachiel looked at his daughter in surprise. The man leaned closer to them and began to look at them. A moment later he smiled and said that it seemed so. The man looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he and his father could not be distinguished. Maybel looked at the man in surprise and asked if they were really that similar. The man smiled and said that they were very similar. The man, puzzled, said that her father looked very young, and therefore he was mistaken. The man smiled and apologized for misunderstanding them. Nosa and once again asked for an apology. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she was constantly told that she was not like anyone else. Therefore she was very jealous of her brother. But now everything has changed. The young lady looked at her father and said with a smile that she and he were very similar. She smiled and said that she was very happy about it. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said with a soft smile that it was natural. After all, she is his daughter. A moment later, the man looked closely at the young lady and said that thank God she was not seriously injured. The man smiled and said that if she wanted to hear an apology from the man who pushed her, then she needed to approach the Bluebeard mercenary squad. He said that their mercenaries were assigned to be responsible for the security of this arena and for its management. A moment later, he asked them if they wanted to take part in the competition. He smiled and said that if they wanted, they could join the team for a fairly small fee, since the leader was a good friend of his. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and asked if anyone could really take part. The man smiled and said that the young lady seemed very interested in participating. He said that this is true and participation is available to everyone. Of course, if he pays for it, true, no one is responsible for the safety of their lives. He smiled and said that it was a joke, because this is a competition between specialists, so it's okay if someone suddenly falls, unless the golem's speed decreases. The man smiled and said that real magical competitions were organized by the masters of magic of those times, but still, they have already died or disappeared, so there is no one to see them off. The magical purge took place several decades ago. Magicians with powerful powers intended to rebel against the imperial family and the church. Anything of magical origin was persecuted. These competitions were also among the forbidden things. Bellerophon looked at the young mistress and told her to look at the golems, since they were made of stone, but imbued with magic. The young lady was puzzled. She looked at them and asked if that meant they were alive too. Bellerophon looked at the young mistress and said that this was not so. Golem created by its owner from inanimate nature. But it is practically elastic, which only listens to his orders. They cannot help but think, hear, or use any emotions. The young lady was a little puzzled. She looked at her friend and said that the maid had previously told her that the golem revived by the wizard becomes a good ally for him. The young man looked at the young lady and said that this is a very old legend. He looked at the young lady and said with a smile that in their days, even an ordinary commoner knows a lot about magic, but this legend was told even before that. Then the magicians used attachment to objects that they had already possessed. The young man looked at the young lady and said, puzzled, that now the golem is only thought of as a tool. The young man said that for this reason they are created randomly whenever needed. The man looked at his companions and said with a smile that she had even cast a spell on them to protect them from falling. He looked at them and said that the competition involved teams of 2, 4, or 8 people. The young lady looked at her father, puzzled. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that she seemed very keen to take part in the competition. The young lady looked at her father embarrassedly and asked if she could. A moment later, she said, puzzled, that she knew she shouldn't, because everyone said it was very dangerous there. The wizard looked at his daughter and said with a smile that there was no reason for refusal. The young lady was a little puzzled because she didn't understand what he was talking about, because everyone had previously said that competitions were very dangerous. Rachiel looked at everyone present and said that the one who told her that it was dangerous there was Khan, not him. The wizard looked at his daughter and calmly said that as long as he was nearby, she would not be in any danger. The man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she seemed eager to participate. He smiled and said that, in that case, he could tell them about the rules. A moment later, the man heard someone calling him. Dave ran up to Killian. Dave patted his comrade on the back. Killian looked at his comrade in surprise and asked what he wanted. Dave looked sideways at the wizard and asked his friend if these were his guests. Dave looked at everyone present and asked his friend if these were the participants. Killian looked at his friend in surprise and said that he seemed to have lost his memory. He said that this was the young lady he recently pushed, and then ran away. Dave looked at the young lady and laughed. He said she was just a baby. Killian looked at his comrade and asked him to stop laughing and said that he needed to apologize, because of him she was almost seriously injured. The man looked at the young lady with contempt and said that he actually didn't remember anything like that. He looked at her with a grin and asked if it could be that nothing had happened. He looked at the wizard and said with contempt that he did not understand at all what he had to apologize for. The wizard was very angry. Dave looked at his friend and told him not to be nervous. He also said that he recently met a guest, and he was lucky enough to receive a huge offer from him. The man patted his chest and said that he would also participate in this competition. Killian looked at his comrade in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Killian looked at his friend and asked how patrolling the arena was. Dave looked at his comrade and asked if there was anything to patrol here. He said that they were placed here as surveillance. He said that even the gentleman who hired them saw that they were hanging around without anything to do and did not say a word. Until he had a casual conversation around the wizard, there was an oppressive aura. Dave looked at his comrade and said with a smile that one way or another he would do it anyway, so there was no need to dissuade him. He smiled and told his comrade to warn the captain. Killian was puzzled by his friend's behavior. He shouted after him to wait. Killian looked at the young lady and said that if she still wanted to participate, then she needed to go to the east gate. When she gets there, she needs to say his name, and she will be able to pass without any problems. He said his name again and said with a smile that they would meet again. Rachiel was very angry. Bellerophon and the butler calmed him down. Rachiel, in a rage, told them to get out of the way, as he intends to destroy everything in his path. Khan looked at his master and said that he could not do this. He looked at the gentleman and said that he himself knew very well that such powerful spells pose a great danger to everyone. Bellerophon looked at his teacher and said that he would rather do it instead. Khan looked at the gentleman and said that these guys were Isol's mercenaries, and if the gentleman used his power, they could be discovered. The young lady was surprised as she had never heard of Isol's mercenaries before, but still she thought carefully and remembered that she had heard this name somewhere. Then a man came to her adoptive father and looked at her with contempt and said that he still leaves trash in the house. Rachiel looked at the butler and asked what this had to do with them. Kang looked at the gentleman and told him not to say that he had not heard that the little lady had wanted to go to the international festival for a long time. Kang said that if they learn about the gentleman's appearance here ahead of time, then for him it will turn out to be a direct path to the palace. And if he uses his power in the place where the mistress was imprisoned, then there will be a disaster. Rachiel looked at the palace as he told her to calm down. He said that he had heard enough chatter, so he needed to stop the idle talk. Rachiel looked at the arena and said that he also intended to take part in the competition. The wizard said that he suddenly became interested in this competition. The man smiled and greeted everyone. He said with a smile that they had all been waiting for this for a very long time. The host smiled and said that after a painfully long time, the Golem Storm competition had returned again. The presenter welcomed everyone to this exciting race. The presenter smiled and said that today would be the first unforgettable race. The racetrack is a simplified form of the former arena for competition and true masters. The host smiled and said that first the magician must saddle the golem and awaken it with his magic. Then you need to climb one of the pillars and fly around the field 3 times. After completing the entire track, participants must make their way to the center of the artificial forest located next to the arena. The magician must take possession of the sign and bring it here. The presenter said that the one who is the first to carry the sign and stick it into this place will be the winner. The young lady looked at the presenter intently and in surprise. She felt uneasy. The wizard looked at his daughter and asked if she was nervous. The young lady said, puzzled, that she was a little scared. The father looked at his daughter and said that there was nothing to be afraid of. He stroked her head tenderly. She looked at her father and said, puzzled, that when she said she wanted to take part in the race, she could not even imagine that so many people would gather here. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that this was not surprising, because this was the first competition in 20 years. Maybel looked at her father in surprise and asked if he had really seen these competitions before. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that he had seen such a competition before. The young lady was a little puzzled and looked at her father and asked if he had seen them alone. She noticed that for just a second his eyes became empty. The wizard took his gaze away from his daughter and said that everything was wrong and they were together. The young lady was puzzled, as she had already seen this sad expression on her face once before. Maybel remembered how he used to tell her that when she smiled, she became like her mother. She realized that there was a possibility that her father went to these competitions with her mother. The young lady was very curious, but she could not continue asking questions, because she did not want to hurt her father with her questions. The young lady looked at her father and said that earlier the butler had told her that if she got very nervous, she should pretend that all people were potatoes. Rachiel looked at his daughter in surprise. Maybel looked at her father and smiled. She said that it was so and began to list all the types of potatoes. Rachiel averted his gaze from the young lady and said that this was typical con chatter. Maybel looked intently at everyone present in the arena and said with a smile that it was so. Killian saw the young lady and greeted her again. He ran up to the young lady with lightning speed and asked with a smile if she would still take part as planned. A moment later, he asked her if she understood all the rules. Maybel looked at him and said with a smile that she understood everything. The man looked at everyone present and said that it must be because the previously closed competitions suddenly returned. More people gathered than he imagined. The man looked at the wizard and asked if he would also participate. Father and daughter looked at the man in surprise. Since he called the wizard brother, Khan came closer to them and said that he was participating. Kang looked at the man and said with a smile that he was a knight who was accompanying the little lady. The man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was from a noble family. Khan looked at the man and said that he didn't have to worry about that since they had deliberately hidden their true position. The man looked at the young lady, puzzled. A moment later, he said that no matter what, he wished her to be strong and win the competition. The young lady sheepishly thanked the man. Killian looked at the young lady and asked if she was nervous right now. Killian looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry. He smiled and said that in any case she was not the only lady in this competition. He said that earlier during professional competitions there were age restrictions, but this time the competitions are more of an entertaining nature, so there are no restrictions. He looked at the young lady and told her to look to the side, as another one of her age was standing there. Killian said that he was the same age as her, also from a noble family like her. The man said that of course he could not confirm anything, but he had heard that this was the son of the head of a noble family sponsoring the competition, and most likely he is here just for fun. Killian looked at his friend and said that this competition was safe. The man smiled and looked at the young lady. He said that she should have fun, just like that noble young man. The man reached out to the young lady to pat her on the head. He smiled and said she needed to calm down and have a good time. But a moment later he froze as his hand began to tremble. He was at a loss. He smiled and wished the young lady good luck in the competition. He looked at the young lady and said that it seemed that if he stayed here any longer, he would be beaten by her father. A moment later he ran away and waved. The presenter looked at all the participants and asked them to start the competition. The young lady smiled and said that apparently everything would begin now. Bellerophon looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he had given her a bird. He looked at the young lady and asked if she had forgotten about her. Maybel looked at her friend in surprise and said with a smile that she had not forgotten. He looked at her and said with a smile that as long as the teacher and he were with her, there would be no danger or injury for her. Maybel looked at her friend confused. Lowering her eyes, she looked at the bird and sheepishly thanked her friend for his concern. The presenter smiled and looked at everyone present. He said that today, after 20 years, the first competition will take place. The presenter said that to match this unforgettable competition, they chose a unique thing as a prize for victory. The prize will be an artifact belonging to the imperial family and sent by them from a magic tower from Osiria itself. The winner's reward is the daughter of Rachiel, filled with magical energy. Maybel was very surprised, as she had never seen anything like this. The presenter said that the daughter of Rachiel, the famous staff with a 200-year history, is remarkable in that its value is still impossible to accurately determine. The young lady looked at the boy in surprise, who stood next to her. When Luther Cyclamen was visited by his friend Isel, he was not alone, but with his son. The young man looked at the young lady with contempt and said that servants were prohibited from entering the library. He looked at her with contempt and asked what they would do if she suddenly stole some precious books. Maybel was a little puzzled and didn't understand how she could forget this boy. The young man looked at his friend in surprise and asked who it was next to him. Claudel looked at his sister with contempt and said with a grin that she was his maid. The young man looked at the young lady with contempt and said that his servant just entered the library. He asked his friend what he would do if she accidentally stole the precious books. Claudel laughed and looked at his sister. He said that she was stupid as a plug, so she definitely wouldn't be able to steal anything. The presenter looked at everyone present and said that everyone who, for whatever reason, was still not participating. Then you need to hurry in order to submit your application on time. He smiled and said that in 3 minutes the acceptance of sports applications for participation in the race would end. Rachiel looked sideways at the butler and said that a set prize of this level for such an entertaining competition was very suspicious. Khan looked at his master and said that he also found it very strange. The wizard said that it was one of two things, or they didn't even have any idea who to give the prize to, or its future owner has already been determined in advance. The wizard looked at his daughter and said with a smile that there was no need to worry about it anyway, because the ride on the golem itself would be very interesting and a good experience. The young lady was very happy because she would finally be able to ride the golem. She was very happy and couldn't wait for this moment. The wizard looked at his daughter and said with a smile that he would certainly take care of managing the golem, so she doesn't need to worry, but just needs to hold on tight to the reins. The young lady smiled and thanked him. The presenter looked at all the participants and with a smile told them to take their places in front of the golems. Rachiel looked at Riza and Laura and told them to follow Maybel. The sisters smiled and said that they would certainly do everything. Can looked at the gentleman and said with a smile that they would watch everything that was happening from their seats. Maybel looked after them and waved. A moment later she found herself on top of the golem. The wizard looked at his daughter and asked if she was ready. The young lady smiled and said she was ready. The presenter looked at everyone present and asked to wait another minute, since the magicians themselves should come up now. The wizard looked at his daughter and told her to sit quietly and not move. She nodded and agreed. A moment later the wizard cast a spell. The presenter looked at everyone present and said with a smile that finally all the golems woke up. The golem woke up and roared. After waking up there was a noise and a big roar and a strong wind blew. The presenter looked at everyone present and said with a smile that now they could see a very breathtaking sight. The golem in turn growled and was ready. The young lady hesitated a little and was afraid. She felt uneasy. The wizard looked sideways at his daughter and said that her golem was a red dragon, and his name is Drake. The young lady slowly opened her eyes and looked at the dragon in surprise. She looked at the dragon in surprise and said that it was not red. The wizard said that the red drake is a type of hornless dragon. The wizard said that they were usually small in size, but they were said to have a fierce temperament. And they have one habit of going ahead. They were also said to be eager to fight. Red, the rarest and most powerful dragons among drakes. The presenter looked at all the participants and asked if they were ready. He said that these competitions involve teams and, of course, single participants, so to avoid injustice, their future route will be predetermined. The young lady looked at her father and said, puzzled, that the location had been changed. Rachiel looked at his daughter and said that she did not need to worry about it, because it won't cause any problems. The young lady was confused because she and her dad were separating and she was very nervous about it. She was afraid that she might do something wrong and hurt herself. She didn't know what would happen if that happened. The man looked at the young lady and told her to go that way. Maybel looked sideways at her father. She noticed that he was not worried at all. When she got lost, she was told that he had been persistently searching for her. She didn't know if she could handle it alone. The sisters flew up to her. Maybel was surprised that they were near her. Maybel looked at the sisters in surprise, and she said that when they disappeared recently, she thought they were back in the stands. She looked at them and asked what happened to them. The sisters looked at her mistress differently and said that everything was not so at all. They said that the master ordered them to be near her and look after her. Therefore, they reincarnated and decided to immediately come to her. The young lady was very happy because she realized that her father was very worried about her. Riza looked at the young mistress and said that they had to get out somehow, and the leader was blocking their passage, and so they had to reincarnate. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that they had to reincarnate, but they reincarnated without any doubt. The sisters looked at the young lady and said that this was their secret, since reduced bodies are an ability not subject to any other magical creature, because the elves, who had the ability of magical transformation, like the nymphs, disappeared. They looked at the young lady and said that she had master's magic and a bird, so there are no problems. But still, the little lady's safety is very important to everyone. The sisters smiled and said that for this reason, they would stick to her like leaves and would follow her everywhere. The young lady looked at them and said that they should not fall behind. Laura smiled and said that they would never leave her side. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that she, being in such a small form, they can control magic a little so they can help her. The young lady asked them, puzzled, if in their normal form they could not use magic. Laura said that this ability is only available to the elder sister. Laura said that their eldest sister is the smartest among them and therefore is good at magic. The young lady looked at Laura and said with a smile that she would also succeed. Laura looked at the lady in surprise and asked if it was true. The young lady did not know whether she had the right, not possessing magic, to say such things. Laura smiled and thanked the young mistress. She said that thanks to her, she was filled with strength. The young lady smiled, as she at least managed to improve Laura's mood a little. The young man looked at everyone present and wondered what kind of nook this was. He said that competing with these laymen was very annoying. He also said that the venue was simply disgusting. The man looked at the young man and with a smile told his master that in fact the best places were on this side. The young man looked at the man in surprise and asked why he thought this was the best place. The man looked at the young man and said that this was a sports arena, a site built taking into account various factors. He said that as they headed towards the forest, the wind would pick up, and most of the participants will get lost there, but this place has a special landscape that will become a barrier to the wind, so this will not happen. Riza was furious as she noticed the man pushing the young mistress. The young lady looked at the men and the young man in surprise, because she realized who was in front of her. The young man looked at the man and said, "It really will be like this." The man smiled and said that everything would certainly happen. Riza looked at Maybel and asked if she should drag the man here for his plush beard. Laura looked at the man and said that he was just nasty. The young lady looked at the sisters and said that there was no need for that, and she was fine. The young man looked sideways at Maybel. She was a little puzzled and her heart sank because she felt his gaze. The young man looked at the young lady and said that she was very small. He looked at her with contempt and said that if such a petty person was participating, so this is truly a third-rate competition. The young lady was puzzled. She did not know what to do if he recognized her. He looked at her and asked, since she was standing next to his golem, she wouldn't have any objections. He looked at her with contempt and said that he was only in it for fun anyway. He said that it was all because the prize was exhibited here by right of his. Maybel was a little puzzled because her father had recently told her about this. She was very happy, because it seemed to her that he did not recognize her. She hoped that he would never recognize her. The man looked at the young master and said that they should prepare quietly. The young man looked closely at the young lady. He told the man not to remind him of what he already knew. The young man looked at the young lady and, puzzled, said that they had already met with their grandfather before. She was very familiar to him, but unfortunately he did not remember where he had seen her before. The young lady was taken aback, as she was afraid that he might remember. Laura would have flown closer to the young mistress and asked if they really knew each other. A moment later, the young man looked at her and said that he seemed to remember her. He picked on her and said that she was Claudel's servant, and last time I brought him tea. He said that he definitely remembered this strange eye color, and now she always recognizes him. He looked at her and with a grin asked what she forgot here. A moment later, he looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really run away. She knew he wasn't wrong when he said that. After all, she ran away from the Cyclamen house with her own feet. She knew everything was fine, and she didn't need to worry about it because she would never go back there. The young man said that Claudel has been very lethargic lately. He looked at the young lady in surprise and said that it was probably because of this. The young lady knew it was all a lie, and it wasn't because of her that he felt bad, no matter how it was. After all, he was a fickle boy. The young man looked at her and asked what he should do now. He said that he had previously heard that runaway servants were punished by flogging. The young lady was shaking with fear and did not know what to say. A moment later, she angrily shouted that she was not a servant. The young man was very surprised, as he did not expect this. He looked at her and asked how dare she raise her voice at him, being in the position of an insignificant servant. She looked at him and said with rage that she was no servant. The young lady thought for a moment and realized that she had no reason to fear that he would recognize her. She knew that she had protection around her and that her friends were sitting in the stands. She knew that her father was somewhere not far from her. She knew that he would certainly protect her and come to her aid when she needed it. She looked at him and angrily told him not to call her a servant anymore. The young man looked at her in bewilderment and asked what he should call her. He was surprised and asked who she was. She looked at him and said that she was his friend's older sister. A moment later, she said that she was his cousin. The young man looked at her and said that she was lying to him, since his friend said that he had no brothers and sisters. He said that this was a vile lie, since his friend had told everything, and it was before the day when he called her a servant. The young lady looked at the young man, puzzled, and told him to stop, as it did not matter what he called her, since it was all in the past. She looked at him and said that who could continue to call her like that without understanding it at all? It was simply tactless. He looked at her and said that he understood her. He looked at her with a grin and said that she should at least try harder this time. He looked at her sideways and with a grin on his face said that she was wretched, and so was her golem. The young lady was surprised as she expected more from him. She thought there would be something else. She thought that if he was her brother's friend, he should be as intrusive as his brother. In fact, she took it for granted, but now it's not like that. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she realized that she seemed to be much more afraid of her brother and the Cyclamen estate than she had thought. She knew those memories would definitely hurt her. Laura looked at her mistress and asked her if they should beat that bastard. Riza looked at the mistress and asked if they could push this impudent face off the golem. The young lady smiled and thanked them for their concern. A moment later, she said there was no need to do that. Maybel knew that because there were two gentle voices nearby whispering to her incessantly, she was no longer as scared as before. She looked at the sisters and said with a smile that it looked like the competition was about to begin. Maybel didn't know if she could have a good time at the competition, but she hoped so. The presenter looked at all the participants present and asked if they were ready for the competition. The young lady knew that everything would be fine because her father told her to just have fun and not think about anything. A moment later, the leader gave a sign, and they took off into the sky with the speed of lightning. The young lady looked at everyone in surprise. She was very surprised, since she had never experienced anything like this before. The young lady looked at her friends and asked if they were okay. Laura looked at the young lady and said that they were fine. She said that their people were not susceptible to the effects of wind currents. Laura looked at the young mistress and asked if she was okay, since the other golems were already moving away. The young lady smiled and said that she was fine and that she didn't take part to win anyway. The young lady looked at her friends in surprise and asked if they had seen objects floating in his circle of athletes. Laura looked at her and said that these are another golems on very small shins that are tracking a spell. They watched every athlete. Laura looked at the young lady and said with a smile that they were flying. The young lady smiled and said that they were flying, and it was very beautiful. She was very happy and surprised, because she now understood the feeling of flying. A young man flew up to her and asked with a grin if this was really how she was trying. A moment later, he said he thought of something. He looked at her and said that as far as he remembers, anyone can punish the runaway servant in any way. The young lady looked at the young man and said that she was not a servant. The young man asked with a grin why her brother treated her like that. He looked at her and said that since she ran away, she should be punished immediately. The young man snapped his fingers and she lost control for a moment. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was behaving this way. He looked at her and said with a grin that he had done nothing wrong, only slightly weakened the magic hidden in the golem's core. The young man flew, and the young lady in turn began to fall down. The young man said with a grin that he made the golem collapse like it is now. The young lady was very frightened, as she was afraid that she might fall from such a great height. The young man said with a grin not to worry, as he would not die. He said that if anyone was seriously injured, the competition would be suspended, and he would not be able to win his prize. Riza rushed towards the young lady in a hurry. She said the golem closed its eyes. Laura looked at her sister and asked if she could awaken him again. Laura was a little puzzled. She said that they don't know how to handle the mechanism of human magicians. Laura looked at the young mistress and told her to use her magic. The young lady was very puzzled. She was trembling because she knew that there was no chance that she would succeed. Having the ability to sense magical power, she could not cope with even a single light spell, so no one treated her as she should. Riza looked at the young mistress in horror and said that she could do anything. She frantically begged her mistress to use her magical power in the golem mechanism. The young lady knew that compared to her brilliant brother, she was not capable of anything. She was shaking and crying. Trembling with fear, she said that she could not use magic. The young lady, puzzled, said that she did not know magic. Riza looked at her and said that was not true. She said that the little lady is able to see them in the form of nymphs, which already indicates that she has unimaginable abilities. Riza smiled and said that she would succeed. Maybel was puzzled and scared. She didn't know what to do, since she couldn't even create a rune. Riza looked at her and said that there is no time for this, and even the owner does not create anything like this. Riza said that the fundamental basis of magic is a sincere desire, like during prayer. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't know if she could do it, but she knew that she definitely had to cope with something like this. She prayed and asked magic to transport her. She didn't know whether she should wish for something more sincere. She was very frightened and did not know what to ask. A moment later, she clung tightly to the golem and furiously shouted for it to take off. A moment later, the golem took off. A moment later, the young lady flew up and saw her father next to her as she opened her eyes. The young lady heard an incomprehensible noise. Looking down, she saw golems clashing. There was a real struggle there. Maybel was surprised, since such a fight between golems is possible only in professional competitions. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that he thought it was just a game. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and called to him. A moment later, she asked him how this was possible, since she was definitely falling. The wizard was surprised. He looked at his daughter and asked what she was talking about, since now she was flying beautifully on horseback. Maybel was taken aback and realized that she was really flying. She looked at her father in surprise and asked how he did it. The wizard smiled and said that he flies thanks to her powers. He was surprised and asked her if she didn't feel it. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand what her father was talking about. She knew that she had no strength and did not understand how this was possible. A moment later, her golem growled. The young lady was scared because she did not expect this. The young lady was puzzled as she realized that the golem debris below was thanks to her. She said she did it. You are the moment he bumped into her. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that the mere possibility of battle briefly revived him, unlike her. The wizard looked at his daughter in surprise and asked if she was going to fly. The young lady was a little puzzled and didn't understand what she was talking about. The wizard looked at her and said that they were still not late. He said that if they went now, they could fight the others. A moment later, she remembered the race. She just wanted to ride the shin for once, not participate in the race itself. However, her words were at odds with her feelings, and sooner or later they would spill out. She looked at her father and asked if they could continue the chase. The wizard looked sideways at his daughter and said that the fact that she had awakened was already quite enough to close the gap, but others would also increase their strength. The golem beneath the young lady growled. The young lady looked at her father and asked if she had put herself in danger. Rachiel looked at her sideways and said that he did not say that. He said she had him and she would never be in danger again. A moment later, the nymphs flew up to the young mistress. The young lady looked at the young nymphs and asked if they were okay, as she was worried about them since she did not hear their voices. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that they were repelled by the little mistress's magic. Maybel had previously heard from Bellerophon that golems could neither think nor experience feelings. She was surprised and didn't understand why she felt like her golem was answering her. The young lady looked at her golem and asked if it could fly with her. The golem, in turn, roared loudly. The young lady looked at the nymphs and asked what was wrong with her father. Laura looked at her young mistress and said that the owner was trailing behind. Riza said that he was in no hurry at all. Laura said that the owner is generally not interested in the race. Riza said it was because he was looking for something alone. The young lady was a little surprised and did not understand what her father was really looking for. Laura looked at the young madam and said with a smile that the young madam had overtaken everyone, and even that young man was left behind. Riza looked at the young lady and told her to take it to the right. She said it would be easier to turn around there. A moment later, the young lady followed all the instructions and flew through all the obstacles with the speed of lightning. The golem smiled and growled like a cat. The young lady was surprised and thought she should praise him. A moment later, the youth and lady stroked the golem and said that it was a good job. Riza looked at the young lady and said with a smile that the golem seemed to be in good spirits. Maybel asked if it was true. Riza smiled and said that this golem only calls out to the little lady's voice, and he seemed to really like her. Maybel was very glad that she managed to get along with the golem. Now that they had overcome this stage, they flew straight into the forest. A moment later, the young lady slowly flew towards the forest. She knew she had to find the flag. A moment later, the robe was very surprised when she looked to the side. She looked at the young lady and said that the boy who bullied her could be seen there. Riza was very frightened. She said with rage that he flew closer to her. A moment later, the young lady heard a loud explosion. She turned around and heard that there was an attack in the sky. She was shocked because she did not expect to see something like this. The men looked at each other in surprise, and one man asked what it was. The other man looked at his companion and said that it was a battle of golems. The first man was surprised because he did not expect this to happen. He said it was a simple competition, and this shouldn't happen. The young lady flew slowly and watched all the participants. She was very scared and did not know what to do in such a situation. She stubbornly moved forward, but she didn't even think about going to battle. Laura looked at the young mistress and said that there, next to her, the man who pushed her earlier. The man looked at the young lady with contempt and said that if she didn't want to get hurt, then she shouldn't even move in that direction. The young lady looked at the nymphs and asked if they thought she could somehow outrun this path. Laura looked at the young mistress in surprise and said that, to be honest, she had never really fought, so it would be better for her to fly around the man. Riza flew closer to the young lady and said that if we talk about a simple bypass, there is one way. The young lady was surprised. She looked at the nymph and asked what method she suggested. Riza said that in return she would have to take a small risk. She was a little puzzled and didn't know whether the owner would get back at them after that. The young lady looked at her friends and said that she would definitely cover for her. A moment later, she sank, because she didn't know if she could stop her dad from getting angry. The young lady, puzzled, said that most likely they would both get screwed. Riza flew closer to her and stroked her cheek tenderly. She said that young miss should try to keep everything secret that she told her earlier. Riza said that the young lady must find the flag and bring it from this forest. She said that during the flight, they looked here from the sky, so the center of the forest was clearly visible. Riza looked at the young lady and asked how about flying from above. Maybel was very surprised. Riza said that the young mistress needs to fly high into the air and then dive sharply. Riza said that they obviously would not expect such care from her. The young lady said that she understood her, since she had already done this when she fell. Riza smiled and said that was exactly the case. The young lady knew that if only she could control the speed, she would be able to take the flag. Before that boy, I looked at my friends and agreed with them. Also, a moment later, she said that they now need to get up. The young lady slowly began to put her plan into reality. She slowly rose higher and higher. The young lady looked at the nymphs and asked if they needed to go even higher. Riza looked at the young mistress and said that she thought this height was enough. The young lady was a little puzzled and didn't know if she really should just go down. If she were ordinary, she would have given up everything, given up even earlier, and would not have been prepared to go so far. But now, she does not want to give up. She looked at her new friend and said with a smile that he should come down when she gave the signal. A moment later, the young lady signaled to her friend, and they began to descend with lightning speed. The young lady looked at the chasuble and asked if she would be okay. Riza hugged the young lady tightly and said that she would be fine as long as the owner didn't find out about it. The young lady smiled as she realized that even in such a terrible moment, she was only worried about not being caught by the master. She knew her father was left far behind, so she knew everything would be okay. A moment later, she felt someone's gaze on her. Turning around, she saw a young man who was looking at her with anger. The young man looked at his companion and angrily told him to fly there. The young nymphs looked at their mistress and told her to fly to the side. The young lady had a task. She did not know what to do, since she could not even imagine that the golem Dave is pointed so fast. She realized that at this rate they would soon find themselves together. She was a little puzzled, because she knew that the hall was right under her nose, and she only needed to fly to it. She understood that if this continued, they might lose the flag. Dave was catching up with the young lady. He looked at her and asked if she really wanted to cheat. A moment later, the young lady heard a loud sound. She was surprised and did not understand what had happened. A moment later, through the veil of fog, she saw her father. The wizard looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he had found her. Dave was in shock and did not understand why he was attacked. He looked at the wizard and asked what was going on. The wizard looked at the man angrily and said that if he needed a reason, then it would be his ignorance. With the speed of lightning, the man began to fly away. A moment later, the wizard, with the help of his dragon, attacked the man and he, hit, fell down. The young lady called out to her father in surprise. Rachiel looked at his daughter and with a smile told her to continue moving forward. She was puzzled and didn't understand what he was talking about. The wizard looked at her and said that this was not the end. He pointed her in the direction. The young lady looked intently at where her father was pointing. A moment later, she saw the flag. The wizard smiled and, looking at his daughter, said that nothing is as exciting as victory. He looked at her and said that it was just his opinion. A moment later, he asked her what about her. The young lady, with her lightning speed, the rose returned and her golem spread its wings. She passionately wanted to win the competition and definitely win a prize. She looked at her friend and told him to fly even faster. A moment later, she saw the flag. She was glad that he was very close, and she knew that a little more and he would be hers. The young man looked sideways at the young lady and told her to go away and not touch the flag. A moment later, he used magic on her and she was engulfed in flames. He attacked her several times, but referring to her magic. He was furious and shouted that it was the dirty maid who had coveted his thing. Riza flew closer to the young mistress and asked if she was okay. The young lady looked down, puzzled, and said she was fine. The young man was furious. He shouted to her that the flag was his. The young lady gathered herself and said that you don't want to do this anymore, and she is not a maid. She looked at him and told him that he should not underestimate her, as she is stronger than she seems. She pointed to the flag and said with a smile that it did not belong to him. The young man looked at her with a grin and asked if she thought about it that way. He said he had to admit that she did have some skills. The young man looked at her and said with a grin that he was a powerful magician. He is also the future head of the clan. He said that his origin alone gave him superiority over the likes of her. He looked at her and said that from a commotion was caused for some idiot, and now no one will watch them. Riza looked at the young lady and told her not to worry, as the master would definitely look after her. Laura flew up to the young mistress and said that she was flying to the master just in case. The young man flew closer to her and said that everyone was busy with the commotion, so they were now left alone. He looked at the young lady and said with a grin that besides, the little reporter golems have as many opportunities as they want to compromise one of the participants, or the participants themselves may quit the race in the middle of a tense competition. The young lady was puzzled by his words. She remembered that when the rules were explained to her, they said that there might be minor skirmishes between goals, but they will never attack their owner. She was told that since this was not a professional competition, any violations were prohibited, and the moment they become known, the violator will be immediately disqualified. Maybel looked intently at the young man. She knew that she could not fly far from here. She looked at him and said that if he touched her, he would certainly be disqualified. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that it didn't matter, since no one would know about it. He said it would hurt her so much that she wouldn't even be able to speak. He looked at her and said with a grin that he no longer intended to be lenient with her. A moment later, a loud crash was heard, and the young lady saw that the forest was on fire. Maybel was in shock and did not understand how it could be that they had to fight one-on-one. A moment later, a fireball flew towards her. When the ball flew near her, it hit her ear. The young lady looked at the robe and asked her if she could pass. The young lady looked at the young nymph and asked if she could help her. She said that they needed to fly up to the young man. He looked at her and said that she seemed very scared. He told her it was too late. The young lady knew that right now the only way she could win was by capturing the flag before the others. She flew towards the flag but heard loud sounds and explosions behind her. She was very happy as she was approaching the flag. She knew that she had just a little time left. A moment later, the flag was in her hands. She was very glad that she was able to take possession of it. She was happy that she finally succeeded and won. The young lady looked at the chasuble and said with a smile that she took the flag. Riza looked at the young mistress in surprise and said that from the front. The young lady turned around and saw a stream of magical fire heading towards her. She was in shock and very scared. Unexpectedly, a strange fear enveloped her. She didn't even think about the fact that the robe and collar could get damaged. She shouted angrily that she could not allow this to happen. A moment later, an explosion occurred in front of her. She was stunned and did not understand what she had done. She did not know what all this meant since there was purity near her and there was no explosion. A moment later, she saw a stone fall from her golem. She was surprised, did not understand what was happening. A moment later, her golem began spewing fire. The young lady was shocked as she was engulfed in a column of smoke. But after a few minutes, it was all over. The young man looked closely at the young lady. He was very surprised and frightened. The young lady looked at the golem and asked if he was okay. The young man was puzzled. He looked at the young lady and asked how this was even possible. He was shocked because he saw that the golem had yellow eyes and was a red dragon. A moment later, he finally shouted to the young lady to give him the flag. The young lady glared at the young man and said angrily that she would not do this. When she landed on the ground, the young man fell from the golem. Maybel came closer to him and said that the flag was hers. The young man was puzzled, but looked at the young lady and said that this was wrong and not fair according to the rules. He looked at her and said that he would tell his father everything. But he suddenly felt dizzy, and he began to fall. The young lady was surprised that he passed out. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that the young man simply fell asleep. The young lady was surprised as she did not expect to meet her father. The wizard looked at his daughter and asked if she was hurt. The young lady automatically touched her ear and said that she was fine and had just singed her hair a little. He looked at his daughter and said that she had suffered after all. Rachiel said that even if just one hair fell from her head, it would already hurt him. The young lady was surprised as she did not expect to hear such a thing from her father. The wizard touched her ear and hair with tenderness. A moment later, everything was perfect, as if nothing had happened before. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that he had put everyone who was here to sleep, and those two rude people fell into a particularly deep sleep. He said that he also disabled the magic reporters in advance. Rachiel looked at his daughter's golem and said that it would not be very good if he appeared in public like this. A moment later, he used magic and the golem turned completely red. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her father and asked if it was he who revived him. The wizard looked at her and said that he had no merit here since she did it all. The young lady was in shock. She did not believe that she herself had revived the golem. She said that he woke up somehow, but she definitely couldn't do it. Rachiel looked at her and said that she was his daughter, and for her it was natural. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her father and asked if he could do that too. The wizard smiled and said that, of course, he could. The wizard smiled and said that, who are we already? This trick was her mother's special talent. The young lady was puzzled. She stared at her father as he looked a little sad. He said she was breathing life into something inanimate. He looked at her and said that this place needs to be cleaned up. The wizard used magic and the golem gradually began to turn into stone. A moment later, he turned completely to stone. She looked at the golem and asked if everything would be okay. The golem, in turn, obediently purred. The wizard looked at his daughter and said that it seemed that she had done everything she wanted. He looked at her and asked if she was happy. The young lady smiled and said that she had won, and now she was happy. Rachiel looked closely at his daughter. He was very happy and proud. The young lady slowly returned to the arena. A moment later, she landed with a crash. Everyone was shocked and stared at her. They didn't believe that this was the winner. A moment later, they began chanting that this was the winner. The presenter was very puzzled, as he expected the young man to win. He looked at everyone present and said that they were not yet completely convinced that she was the winner. But people still shouted that this girl brought the flag and she is the winner. The presenter was shocked. He did not know how to continue to behave in this situation. A moment later, he looked at the young lady and said that she was becoming the winner. She was very happy because now she was not as scared as before. She saw her friends staring at her with shocked eyes. The presenter looked at the young lady and slowly told her to get up on the pedestal. A moment later, the host said she was the winner. The young lady was very happy and received praise from everyone. The man came closer to Maybel and timidly said that he would like to talk to her about the prize. He looked at her and said, puzzled, that there was a slight problem regarding his presentation. He apologized and asked if she could wait a little. A few minutes later, they sat and waited impatiently for the man who was to present the young lady with her prize. Riza was shocked. She said that the man was definitely related to the young man who was on the battlefield. She looked at the Khan and said that even he thought so, that the prize should definitely be given to the leading young lady. The young lady looked at her father, wondering what he was thinking about. Her friend came closer to her and said that perhaps the teacher also had some thoughts on this matter. The young man smiled and asked the young lady what she thought about this. She said that she was interested in the prize because she thought it was beautiful and very good. The young man smiled and said that apparently she was still thinking about him. He said that this method chooses its owner, and this makes it a valuable artifact. The young lady was puzzled and did not know whether she would be given this staff. She thought she probably just needed to back off and calm down, but she was still puzzled, since the staff could not leave her mind, and she constantly thought about him. Khan looked at the young lady and told her not to lose heart, as everyone knows that she is a winner and will receive her prize. Khan said that the fact that they can hide this incident, but if there is a fuss at the competition because of this, not only will it spread everywhere, but all the profit and fame will bring loss to the creators. Bellerophon looked at them and said that, as is known, when climbing the path of great glory, families of wizards use their influence, as they please. He came and sat close to her, and said with a smile that he heard that she used an incredible spell of hers. Maybel said it turned out amazing, and she herself doesn't know how it happened. She smiled and said everything turned out just as he told her. The young man smiled and said that she was great. Colleagues looked at him closely. She noticed that her friend looked like the son of a nobleman from a noble family. She thought he might be a nobleman. A moment later, she flew up. A few minutes later, she sat down next to her father. She was surprised as she was floating in the air. The wizard looked sideways at his daughter and told them to go their separate ways. He said that from now on, he would no longer see her alone with the young man for more than 1 minute. The young lady was puzzled. She said that she didn't know much, and the young man simply explained everything to her. She looked at her father and said that 1 minute was not enough. The wizard looked at the young man and said 3 minutes and not a second more. The young man smiled and thanked the teacher. He said that his order would be carried out immediately. A moment later, the presenter entered their room. He greeted everyone present and apologized for keeping them waiting. Milady came closer to him. The presenter reached out to pat her on the head, but suddenly his hand froze and began to tremble. An oppressive atmosphere reigned near the young man. Bellerophon smiled at the man and asked if he could keep his hands open. The young man smiled and said that if the leader allows himself such freedom, then he can know all the righteous anger of one person. With the speed of lightning, the man removed his hand and asked everyone to follow him. The presenter looked at the wizard and said that he would certainly escort them to the top floor, since the owner of the arena wants to see the winner and those accompanying her. The presenter said that perhaps they could come to an agreement and get the thing they wanted. The presenter said that they would now take the lift inside the magic tower. A moment later, they all stood in the center of the circle and slowly stood up. She and the lady were surprised since she had never seen anything like this before. A moment later, they found themselves near a large, beautiful door. The presenter entered first and looked at the gentleman and said that the winner had come to him. The man stood up and told everyone to come inside. The man looked at the young lady with contempt and asked if she was the winner. The young lady tensed. The presenter looked at his master and said that this is the girl who is the winner. The gentleman looked at her and said that she was very small and that the milk on her lips was probably not dry yet. The man came closer to her and looked at her in bewilderment. He didn't understand how his nephew could lose to her. The man looked at her with contempt and said that this was simply absurd. A moment later, the young lady realized who the man standing in front of her was. The man looked at her and asked if perhaps she had decided to so brazenly disgrace his family. The man said that apparently even his carefree nephew had made a serious mistake. The man looked at the leader and told him to bring it here. The presenter was tasked. He looked at the gentleman and said that he had said something completely different before. The man said that everything, of course, is so and he does not refuse his words, but still he must bring it here. A moment later, the young lady saw her prize in front of her. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and asked what kind of stick it was. The man laughed and asked if she really called herself a winner. He said it was a prize. The man looked at it and said that it was a real staff. The man said that even she should know what awaits the magician who vouched for his name. He said that if he breaks his word, he will lose his magical power. He said that it was definitely a staff and he wasn't lying. The young lady was surprised. The man looked at the young lady and said with a grin that he didn't know if she knew about it, but this staff chooses its own owner. He said that he couldn't even imagine that mediocrity seemed to use it to be such a staff. He said that the item originally belonged to someone else. He looked at her puzzled and said that it had cost him a lot to steal the secret of such a valuable thing from the imperial family. The presenter was shocked by what the gentleman was saying. The man looked at the presenter and told him to shut up. The man looked at everyone present and asked what these commoners could say to someone. He said that in any case, if the artifact once chooses an owner, then no one can take it away. With the speed of lightning, the man threw a bag of money in front of the young lady. He said there was 1,000,000 gold there. The man looked at the young lady and said that he would give her 10 times more, but he would not give the money for nothing. He said that she would receive 1,000,000 gold pieces if she did not touch the iron staff. The man looked at her and said that there was only one chance to leave here with the staff if she became its owner. The young lady was puzzled, since she had to choose the staff of her master, or 1,000,000 gold. But she knew that from the very beginning her choice had been made. The man looked at her and told her to stop tormenting him, and finally, I've already chosen. She stole a glance at her father. The wizard looked closely at his daughter and nodded. The young lady looked at the man and said that she would like to take the staff. The man was shocked. He did not expect her to choose the staff, but still he said that such a dummy like her was not allowed to hold such a staff. He looked at her and said that she needed to get this over with quickly. The nymphs looked intently at the young lady and wished her good luck. The man was furious. He looked sideways at the leader and said that after he was slapped by dirty commoners, he needed to order that the staff be polished to a shine. The young lady looked closely at the staff and slowly reached for it. She knew that she would be safe when she touched the staff, since her father had not told her anything about it. She took the staff of the hand. She was surprised because the staff was light. A moment later, she saw a slight glow near the staff. She was a little surprised because she heard a voice. The voice asked her what her name was. The young lady, puzzled, said her name was Maybel. The voice asked the young lady if she could see what she liked and what she would like. The voice told her to turn back and see something. The young lady was shocked as she saw the estate. The young lady smiled and said it was very beautiful. A moment later, she saw her friend near the estate. She looked at him confused. A few minutes later, the young lady stood in front of everyone with a staff in her hands. She was surprised because she did not expect that she would succeed. A moment later, a man attacked her screaming. He told the leader to immediately take the staff from the young lady.